Okay, we're live. Hopefully the sound is okay.
So we're live?
Yes.
Okay. I want to welcome everybody to our meeting in person again. This is a real important moment for us. Although our work never stopped, we continue doing what we have to do, even though we were meeting online and Zoom. But now we're back in person, and we want to thank the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. We're here at 21st and Chestnut in the heart of beautiful and impoverished Philadelphia. Yeah, I just want to say this is an exciting time. We've got a lot of work to do. We're approaching some important events, of course, the year Baldwin, and then we've begun meeting about the Henry Winston symposium, which will be on November the 11th, and we just haven't decided where it will be held right now, but it will probably be a two-day symposium. The first day we'll be looking at the documentary that Emile made on Henry Winston and discussing that, and then the next day will be a fuller discussion of his work. And then, of course, the launching of Avant-garde, a journal of peace, democracy, and science, which the first edition will be dedicated to Henry Winston, and that came from the editors, Michelle and Jeremiah. And I think it'll be very, very significant. Although every article will not be on Winston, it'll be many things, but that it will be dedicated to Winston in the 50th anniversary of his book, Strategy for a Black Agenda. And then, of course, the big thing is the year of Baldwin. And already at the University of Pennsylvania, the famous Lotus Collective is re-establishing its work at Penn. And it's very apparent, something that Michelle has said to me over and over again, that there is an audience at the University of Pennsylvania for what the Free School is talking about. And then Purba told me about all of the students, and I guess not students, people who work at the university who were interested in this reading group. And when do y'all start reading?
We're starting this Monday.
This Monday, wow. And so they're the ones launching the year Baldwin. And certainly at the University of Pennsylvania could not be a better place. By the way, we're trying to work on getting Lincoln University as a university to declare 2024 the year Baldwin. And this will be very important. We don't know if it's going to come off. Dwight Murph has met with the president and another professor in the Department of English. I don't think they quite understand what we're talking about. You know, I'm a graduate of Lincoln, and it means something to have gone to what HBCU, historically black college or university, because we always felt that we had a special mission for the liberation of our people, but that vision seems not to be as much alive these days. And so one of the things that Dwight and I are saying, and want to say to the president and those in the faculty, that that Lincoln must dare to be different, must dare to stand out among universities, black and white, in this country. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, we want something big. It might not be as big as we want it. I don't know that I have anything else to say. Of course, 2024 is going to be a year of, as we all know, and of course, we've been preparing ourselves for a moment like this for several years, if you think about it. We are neither shocked nor afraid. There will be, and it's already occurring, a profound political realignment of the country. There has not been a realignment. Oh, hey, Dwight, I just mentioned your name. There's not been a political realignment in the country like this since the election of 1860, or in a lot of ways since the founding of the Republican Party in 1853. So we are living through unusual times. And we'll talk more about this as we go forward. And to do the year of Baldwin in a time like this, and especially at a place like the University of Pennsylvania, where so many students, it's not a choice that they can make, but choices that are made for them, either to submit or go crazy.
Right.
Those are the two options that the elite are presenting to young people. And of course, the free school is saying, well, there's another one, and that is struggle. And knowing your history and living out, and here I'm drawing upon Nathan Barraza, who at our, is my Spanish proper? Where Nathan, in our discussion of Winston and the young generation, he raised the question of time. And although we didn't fully work it out, I think the question of time, or outside of time, or not connected to time, is something that is wreaking havoc upon the souls of young people, be they at an elite university or be they in the streets. And it's, you know, and I guess Michelle, you know, I know she has thought about this. She's said, you know, talked about it to me. I didn't quite understand it all the time, how there is this urgency among young people at Penn to seek the truth and to transcend this holding yourself in suspension, a suspended state where you're neither here nor there, you're neither in something, but you don't know who you are. But this is what I think as we do the Winston symposium, I hope we'll be able to further develop the concept of time and timelessness, or suspended time, and how that affects the psychology, the purposefulness of young people. Because this is what we have, the free school, we have to work this out to free young people from the prison of bourgeois, decadent, nihilistic ideology. And so we're trying to work all that out. So I don't have anything else to say. I turn it back to my worthy colleague, Emily Dunn of the Massachusetts Alliance.
Well, I'm going to quickly turn it to Jeremiah.
Your worthy colleague.
Yeah, my worthy colleague, Jeremiah.
So we can talk about avant-garde and
To coincide with the Winston Symposium. Yeah, actually hearing you talk about the Winston Symposium is really exciting, because connecting it to also the reading group at Penn,
Yes.
and how both, at the end of the day, like, the Winston symposium, the way that it seems like we're going to frame it, and then also the start of the reading collective at Penn, and then plus Avant-garde. But actually I really like the focus on the young generation. Basically the question of like the way Nathan, you were saying, like suspension, being in suspension, but the goal is to
Suspended time.
yeah, suspended time, but that there is always an option, and it may be hidden or kept away from young people for a reason, but there's always the option of struggle. But it's just that it's hidden or people don't even know it is an option. But I feel like that also in some ways relates to the framework of avant-garde and like the purpose, the role and purpose of avant-garde. So.
Yeah, so I guess should I still talk about the Soros? Should I still talk about the Soros?
Yeah, man. You want to start with that and then go to
Okay, yeah.
Because it might, something interestingly, by understanding Soros, this huge figure in social movements, not so much finance, but in his bending global social movements, especially in the developed capitalist countries, towards a certain philosophical, ideological direction, including the redesigning of cities like Philadelphia. And gentrification, of course, but that's what.
Yeah, so there are many things that I feel like are converging right now in terms of just where the free school is at and the ideas that we're talking through, and then also the projects that we are undertaking. Recently in the science reading group, there's been ongoing discussions around quantum physics and quantum theory, and kind of the philosophical questions which have been left unanswered by basically the developments in like physics and science in the past century or so. But recently I became interested, and recently I mean yesterday, in George Soros, who has also, I think, come up recently because, as Doc was saying, Soros' kind of network, the Open Society Foundation, is playing a very significant role in terms of America and the domestic political struggle, and basically kind of the intervention of figures like Soros who represent a certain philosophy into kind of the domestic political struggle. And so yeah, Soros, I was looking into him yesterday, and first of all, the first thing that I learned that I didn't know is that the Open Society Foundation is a direct reference to Karl Popper and his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which was basically a philosophical work which was written during the Cold War as basically a defense of Western liberalism and Western capitalism and quote-unquote Western democracy against the closed societies, the authoritarian societies such as Nazi Germany, but more directly, obviously, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. And so Popper was kind of framing this dichotomy between open societies, meaning the West, and then closed societies, meaning basically the Soviet Union. And that was one thing I didn't realize just factually, that I think even Soros attended lectures by Karl Popper in the UK. And Soros himself is a Hungarian person who I think fled Hungary with his family during World War II and then ended up in kind of the UK and then the US, but kind of related to that, essentially something else that I was learning about was that, so how Soros became a really big figure is that he started a hedge fund which was called the Quantum Group, and the Quantum Group of Funds during, I don't know what decade it was, maybe the 70s or 80s, but this basically became one of the most profitable hedge funds in human history. And something that I thought was really interesting is that the Quantum Fund that was founded by George Soros, which basically enabled him to make like obscene amounts of money and also to kind of gain his reputation as someone who essentially broke national economies, including like the British. Like he made this kind of bet against the British pound sterling at a certain moment, and then that enabled him to make a lot of money. I don't fully understand it all, but that basically his naming it the Quantum Fund was also a direct reference to quantum physics, in particular the uncertainty principle, which is basically kind of that reality doesn't actually exist, but that it is human, basically that human measurement or human action kind of constitutes like I don't know, it's very complicated, and we've been talking about it in the physics group or in the science group. But yeah, I just thought it was very interesting to kind of bring in because I feel like, yeah, it's just a very like complex moment that we're living through, but that so many of the things that we talk about in free school are all interconnected, including the basically the philosophy of something like the Open Society Foundation and how it operates within, whether it's American society or globally, and also this connection with philosophy and with science even, I think is really profound and something that is worth studying and discussing more. But yeah, I think with that also, we can go to Avant-garde, but last week we had...
Can I just say one thing, if you don't mind? I think this is a very important thing. Indeed, Soros did bet, a hedge fund is where you give your money to a fund, an individual, as it were in the case of Soros, and you trust them to make good bets on your money. So he betted against the British pound. He betted when no one could have imagined that the British crown would lose a big share of its value. So he betted that it would do that, where everybody else was saying, oh no, he's just a wild, he's an outside guy, he doesn't know. But his bet paid off. And he gets this great reputation for making bets that paid off. So people with money or institutions with money trust Soros with their money. But then, if you don't mind me saying this, but then he has a larger global agenda, which kind of goes hand in glove with the World Economic Forum, started by Klaus Schwab. Yeah. So you get these parallel developments coming from Europe, but influencing political thinking, especially of the elites in the United States. So Soros recently, that is in the last, let's say, 20 years, has this vision, which is not unlike Klaus Schwab, that capitalism to survive must be redesigned, re-engineered. And while it's coming from the elite, they are sophisticated enough, and this is not just one man, these are think tanks all over the place. They are sophisticated enough to understand that change, to have any authenticity, must appear to come from the bottom. So he'll fund like something like Black Lives Matter, or he'll fund climate change initiatives, under the guise of a Green New Deal. Or he'll be very significant in funding and helping to propagate the anti-Trump movement and all of that, and the kind of propaganda around it. So Soros is a huge figure. And I would just add, he bets on what will be, what could possibly happen. And thus he has this, quantum physics, uncertainty principle, probability. See, they interpret the uncertainty principle as freedom. And of course you get it in the, the Biden administration, everybody else is authoritarian but them, and we can judge all the rest of y'all because, we're the white man and you not the white man. Right. But, to make just, make it real, keep it 100. But he is a huge figure. And I don't think there's ever been a person like George Soros in the world who has convinced powerful people in all sectors of American society, from finance to academia to the political realm, that capitalism needs a redesign. You get a person like AOC. I mean, when I listen to her, I'm hearing the George Soros narrative.
No, well, I just wanted to add that actually something that was very interesting in terms of when I was looking at interviews yesterday is Adam Tooze, the guy who writes for
the New York Times,
other publications. He did a podcast episode exploring the philosophy of George Soros, like yesterday or the day before. But something that was funny about it, even Adam Tooze said, was that he was kind of, before they discussed it, he was like, I was thinking about it, and I don't know if there's any basically academic in the social sciences or humanities who has like a similar kind of trajectory that I have, who has not been funded by the Soros Foundation. And he was like, I received funding from Soros, like basically anyone who is like a similar kind of person as me, all of these academics are all connected to the Soros network. And yeah, I think the one thing I wanted to add to what you're saying is that I think Soros embodies a particular kind of philosophy of the ruling class, which is basically, because the whole uncertainty principle thing, how it gets applied in the social realm is that basically, if I understand it correctly, Soros is like even economic philosophy, which filters down into the philanthropy stuff, is that reality doesn't exist. Like there is no like objective economic system, and that basically reality is what is constituted by the actors who act upon it. And so for the ruling elite, that means that whether capitalism itself has basically developed contradictions which cannot be resolved except through an actual like scientific process, that doesn't matter to them, and instead what matters to them is, only our narrative about capitalism matters. Only what we decide in terms of like the future of basically capitalism or of like the world system, etc. Like all that matters is really what we determine. And so long as we can basically keep this charade up, then nothing will happen because we're the ones who get to decide like what will happen to all this stuff. So
I would say one thing. I think they're more robust in the way they see the world. They said if Lenin leading the Russian Revolution could change the world, if Mao leading the Chinese Revolution could change the world, then why should we, who support, I propose, free market capitalism, why aren't we as bold as they? You see what I'm saying? And so we can constitute a revolution from above. And he would say that all revolutions are led by elites, but elites must win the masses. And they're almost going off of, the Leninist playbook for the purpose of redesigning or re-engineering world capitalism. It's a fascinating thing, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because we must understand the political ideological forces that we're dealing with. It's not enough to say the ruling class or the ruling elite. Who is in the vanguard of thought of the ruling class? Why are all of these young people in a state of depression? Why do they not see the future as Soros and those see it? Why do we have Kensington in Philadelphia? If you guys know it all, so that I just wanted to say, that's what to say.
Okay, we can move to Avant-garde. So I think this ties in pretty well actually to Avant-garde and what we're trying to do with the journal. But last week we had read the mission statement for the journal and we talked about it a little bit, but we just wanted to first reread the mission statement in person, because I feel like it just has a different quality to it when you're talking about it in person. And then also, people have had a chance to think about it, or upon hearing it again, just like responses, thoughts, like how can we basically, this is kind of our stating what we think is like the project of this journal, what we think it can achieve, why we're doing this in the first place. Yeah, if it's okay, I can just quickly read the statement and then get into discussion.
Speak up a little bit too.
Okay, so Avant-garde, a journal of peace, democracy, and science, seeks to advance the struggle of ideas at the dawning of a new revolutionary period in American and world history. In such a moment of possibility, our journal insists upon the capacity of people to think for themselves in new and profound ways, and to see the possibilities for a new world. Avant-garde aims to be a publication where...
Could we say new and creative ways? You can, that's just my suggestion. You don't have to use. Use creative and new, creative and profound. But creative should be there.
Okay, so our journal insists upon the capacity of people to think for themselves in new and creative ways and to see the possibilities for a new world. Avant-garde aims to be a publication where ideas can live and breathe, producing writing and art that speak to people from every facet of their lives. Our journal commits itself to principles associated with the best of the avant-garde ethos: courage in standing for ideas that are worthy of the people, and science in seeking to arrive at the truth through disciplined experimentation along several modes of discovery and inquiry. It is with this spirit that we inherit the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Baldwin, claiming them as figures for our time. We see ourselves in the tradition of the Black freedom struggle and the breakthroughs that it achieved in human consciousness, in theories of democracy and social change, and in methods of revolutionary struggle. We link ourselves to the fearless innovation and imaginary of John Coltrane, Sun Ra, Duke Ellington, Nina Simone, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, Alice Coltrane, Stevie Wonder, Archie Shepp, Max Roach, Ornette Coleman, and many others, artists who are part of the struggle for freedom in the United States. We use the concept of the avant-garde as they do, in recognition of a people already in motion, hastening to make all things new. As a world historic concept, the avant-garde speaks to new and experimental movements in art, music, and politics. In the US, it emerges directly from the effort to connect progressive and revolutionary ideas to people's strivings for freedom and peace. Hence, we seek to recapture the avant-garde from the ruling elite, who have distorted its meaning into a farce of trivial, decadent pursuits far removed from the people. We see the struggle of ideas as an existential question confronting all forces in society that struggle for progress. We thus place ourselves squarely among those broad sections of the American people who are searching for a future, who are challenging the philosophy, values, and legitimacy of a dying regime in the United States. The American people today are in open rebellion against their ruling class. This rebellion manifests in many ways, from the groundswell of support for populist candidates in the 2024 presidential race to the broader collapse in public...
Can I say one thing? Rather than populist, why don't you, not, because populism could be, they kind of use it, non-establishment, anti-establishment. Is that fair?
From the groundswell of support for anti-establishment candidates in the 2024 presidential race to the broader collapse in public trust toward major institutions of rule in U.S. life, America faces a profound crisis. The ruling elite cannot rule in the old way, making it the task of the people to find their own solutions to resolve the crisis. Contrary to the claims of those who defend the status quo, the American people are not an ignorant, hateful mass interested in imposing a fascist regime upon themselves. Rather, they seek a new type of democracy, and maybe we could add here the peace industrial economy part.
Yes.
And in the process, a new American people is being born. This democratic movement in the US is commensurate with much larger global processes, what can be called an Afro-Asiatic reconstitution of humanity, the democratic recentering of the world order toward the most densely populated and creatively fertile civilizations on the planet. In this light, we recognize that the advances of the 20th century, namely the socialist, anti-colonial, civil rights, and working class movements and revolutions, forged a new global consciousness through the freeing of humanity's majority, and in turn created new possibilities for revolutionary change. Old ideas of revolution are no longer sufficient for this time. We are therefore dedicated to the pursuit of clarity, cutting through manufactured ideas pushed by a ruling elite who seek to divide humanity, and discarding the dogmatism of a left that believes knowledge comes from the top down rather than belonging naturally to the people. Unafraid, we strive to live the truth. Indeed, we greet the present moment as greater numbers of ordinary Americans proceed upon a new field of politics on their own terms, striving to know one another in new ways and to rediscover their capacity as agents of history. Avant-garde emerges from the thinking of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation, a unique project which has for more than a decade endeavored to create spaces of moral, spiritual, and political education for the people of Philadelphia, remaining rooted in...
Especially the youth. Especially youth and children.
Especially the youth and children.
Is that all right to say?
Remaining rooted in Philadelphia, simultaneously America's poorest major city and a ravaged living symbol of deindustrialization, as well as a creative epicenter of art and culture and the birthplace of many revolutionary traditions, our journal seeks to engage with the vast and varied coalition of the discontented in our country, and with all people who are sincerely searching for a way out of despair, with men and women of every creed and color who fight for peace and democracy. We embrace the responsibility of exploring questions that the people themselves have put on the table, questions of war and peace, of poverty, of democracy, and of our shared future with each other and all humanity. We are ultimately optimists about the future, standing on the foundation of previous revolutions in our nation's history, the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and the Revolution of 1776. We believe that a fourth American Revolution is possible. Armed with the fire and force of new ideas, we are confident that the American people can make it so. I don't know if anyone who's been also working on the journal or working on articles wants to add things to it.
Like saying we should say what we're working on.
Yeah, that what you want?
Say that again.
So, like anyone who's been, well, also, I could also say that the articles that we're working on for the first issue, since I don't think we covered that last time, but yeah, so in addition to this mission statement, we have a lot of articles and different pieces that are being developed for the first issue of Avant-garde, which we're hoping to launch in November to coincide with also the Henry Winston event. But Doc is writing an essay on Henry Winston, which I think will be very good for introducing Henry Winston as a world historic figure, and as someone who speaks to this moment of American history. So there's that. And then we also have Emily writing an article on Trotskyism, and especially investigating Trotskyism and its how it's being used against the youth in America today, and sort of as a contemporary phenomenon, like an ideological contemporary phenomenon. And then we have Kathy developing an article on free jazz, and in particular focusing on a figure such as Archie Shepp, who was produced by Philadelphia, and then went on to become part of this world movement, which was kind of symbolized by his performance along with Bill Dixon at the World Festival of Youth and Students in 1962 in Helsinki, and kind of like investigating both the historical but also even kind of the philosophical and ideological kind of underpinnings of what that means. And then we have...
That's more complicated than what we talk about. And deindustrialization.
Yeah.
That's all.
What does that say?
But there are others, so don't be first.
Yeah, and then so along with that we have Nuri developing an article on basically the concept of civilization as an idea for this time, and that's kind of also building on the presentation that she gave at the Korea event, which was using a lot of Robeson, and I think can work in kind of this concept of the Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration. And then we have Eddie writing an article, kind of an article to Mexican Americans, and in particular like young Mexican Americans for this time, and what is the relationship for basically a younger generation of immigrants and their relationship to this country, but also their relationship to something like the Black freedom struggle, and how young people could see themselves as part of this tradition, and like how is it that anyone will encounter these ideas in American society. And also, I think, you know, also this is kind of in conversation with Minister Abel Mohammed's presentation at the Chicago event as well. And then we have Jahan writing a critique of Gerald Horne and the 1619 Project with settler colonialism, and how all of these ideologies are being weaponized in this time. And then kind of related to that, I'm writing a critique of Norman Finkelstein's new book on identity politics and cancel culture and wokeness and all this stuff, and how also this is like another kind of ideological trend, especially within the left, which is like, yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it more in the article. And then we have, in addition to those articles, I think those are the articles, and then we also have artwork that's going to be going into the issue. And so Serafina is developing either a painting or series of paintings on Black Reconstruction, and also writing stuff to go along with it, like a statement in terms of what is the role of the artist, like in this time. And then Michelle is also developing kind of a photo series or photo history of the Free School, because, you know, Michelle has been documenting many of the free, not just the events, but also just kind of the trajectory of the Free School itself over the past few years. And so, yeah, so there's articles, but also art that are going into this first issue. And so we're trying to work out also all the logistical aspects of the journal, which are many and varied, but yeah, it's really exciting, and we want this to be something which is part of the life of Free School and which adds to the life of Free School, and also, you know, can be something that advances also the project as something like the Year of Baldwin, for instance, going forward into the next year. Yeah.
Wait, I want to say something. Yeah. Well, first, thanks for reading it and everything that you were saying as well.
Could you speak up a little bit,
Okay,
please?
well, I wanted to add that I think of Avant-garde just like Free School as a uniquely American project. And when we're conceptualizing Avant-garde now, I can't help but go back to the formulations we made with the 10th anniversary, especially this possibility and this making and the remaking of the new American people. And I really see Avant-garde as an unprecedented contribution toward this project of unity of the American people, writing the American future. And yeah, like hearing you describe all of the articles, Jeremiah, and all of the projects that are going to be housed in this first issue, which, like you said, is dedicated to Henry Winston, who also means so much to us, like has been so important for our ideological foundation. It actually makes me emotional because I know that these are the ideas that the American people deserve, especially in this time of crisis, when it's so clear that the left is depraved, it's so clear that the political leaders of the cities of this country have failed its people. Like, Avant-garde, I almost see it as like a new rupture. Yeah, and also I'll say I think it's inseparable from Free School. Like it's a very unique project. Like uniquely American, uniquely coming out of Free School, and I think it'll be very important given the political situation.
Yeah, I like how you put it, the American project, because of the past Free Schools that we had and the nature of the crisis, the conversation that we're going to have about neocolonialism. What you're also reminding me is how decisive everything, like whether that be in the presidential election coming up that we've been looking at, and what we do is just, it means a lot. It's very a decisive thing. But then that reminds me of how important the ideological struggle is, and how essentially the ideological battlefield, in a way, is kind of where it's at. Like this, you can't avoid it. Going back to the George Soros thing, the attack on the youth, the attack on the American people, the industrialization, it all ties to how the ruling elite and whom they are want to control the American people. And like with avant-garde, and what we're doing is we're saying that it's like we're all lined up and we're attacking back at all the ideological fronts that have been under kind of like attack, whether that be in art, whether that be in how we view ourselves as an American people, in our history, in our sciences, in our literature, anything. These are the lines that we are kind of like clarifying upon and striking back at, which is also really important.
Yeah, well, because I think part of what I'm also trying to say is that this isn't a quote-unquote left journal by any, it's just not. It's like, this is a very distinctive project. And you know, the way that we're going to have, for example, a critique of Norman Finkelstein, that's very important because so many people look to him as an ideological hero, and they've been robbed of the truth of what actually the history and the crisis in this nation is and what the way out is. So there's that, but then you have something like Kathy's article, which is also about revealing the truth, but focusing on like the possibility of what it means when you're rooted in a tradition for freedom, like an artistic tradition for freedom, and that there is a record that shows that this has happened. It exists, it's possible. And no journal that I've read out there comes close to being able to achieve, like cover this entire frontier of establishing the historical truth, clarifying the ideological contradictions, clarifying the crisis, and then also writing, like also creatively establishing hope, like a positive way forward. And we've been very deliberate in trying to cover all of that in this journal. And so I do think there's nothing like it. I feel really strongly about it.
Yeah, just to add to what you both are saying, something that Serafina and I were talking about recently was, yeah, I think Doc, you had said this phrase maybe like a year or two ago about free school going on the ideological offensive, and that had always stuck with me because I was like, oh, I don't know what that means, but it sounds exciting. And I feel like this journal is one manifestation of the free school going on the ideological offensive, but what does it mean to go on the offensive wielding, as we say, a sword that heals? We're not going on the offensive to basically tear the people down, but to build the people up. And I feel like that is a unique distinction and a unique part of just like the free school philosophy and how we see ourselves and how we see our role in this like current moment of history and in the political landscape, whether in Philadelphia or in a broader sense. So yeah, I just wanted to also add to that.
And I think it's really important, it is actually what everyone is saying, because we're essentially asserting that the remaking of the new American people will be hinged on ideas, and ideas that will win the hearts and minds of the people. And well, even before that, that people just going about their daily lives are already being propagandized in ways that they might not admit or even realize. And it's important that this journal, actually significant that this journal is even based on or celebrates Winston, and that in November we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Strategy for Black Agenda. Because in that book, it is his analysis of his time. What were the ideological trends of that time? And actually what his critique of it was, in order, and what you were saying in terms of the ideological, or the, sorry, what was the term?
Offensive
Yeah, ideological offensive also reminds me of the battle for ideas. You know, there is a battle of ideas, which is that that ideas can also change, that ideas that move people, which are the ideas that will convince people that of the path that they are to choose. And this is actually a good segue to neocolonialism, because one of the chapters of Nkrumah's neocolonialism is the truth behind the headlines, meaning headlines that are common in today's newspapers. You know, they might be simply worded, but there's a message always beneath it if you dig deeper. And I think that's what we're trying to, like, I'm really excited because I think it will rustle feathers in the sense of whether it's like those who look up to Finkelstein, those who are involved in Trotskyism in some way or another, but it provides clarity of like what exactly are those trends that very much influence the youth of today.
Also, like, there's always been an attack on Du Bois, but I think with what we're doing, moving into 2024, and then what we're going to do with 2024, creates an entire like kaleidoscope of like, well, you can't really attack Du Bois if you then want to take down Baldwin, or then want to take down King, or then you can't actually get to him because we're talking from a certain framework that is developed in an epochal time where like the America that needs to emerge, you know what I mean, like is in tandem with this Russia or with China that are associating with each other, that are assuming that imperialism is going to be in collapse, and there isn't that much of a future, like of the Soros foundations or the whatever G6 or whatever people, G7. But that only means too that the like momentous indecisiveness of this country also is on the table. That's what's on the table, because like what America and the American people will think about, what they will do, is also what the entire world both needs in this moment, and then like will be able to use. Like without King, where will the rest of there's something missing. But we're using King, so we're reminding the American people, or like, well, how do we see the American state and our government when all those questions are something that we are putting out, that's something that we're putting out, but the American people are discussing. This is what this country is trying to figure out. And so it's at a particular time, to me, that makes it all the more important, and that the ideological struggle being a more common used term is important to me, because it's about how young people are willing to also struggle for the same future, to fit in the rest of the world that is also emerging and struggling to become. But
I just want to add something to what Serafin was saying, because when you were describing all the articles that go into the first issue even, and considering that this is just the first issue, there will be so many more which handles all the different aspects, but there's also something to be said in bringing these ideas together as part of one scaffolding, because this is part of the ideological attack, is that like you divide people into different categories so they never can talk to each other, you also divide ideas into neat little categories so that you can within each category build up experts who can claim to know everything about one thing but really know nothing, because all of these things are actually connected, which is why talking about Soros and talking about string theory and then talking about art and jazz, all of it makes sense, because it's just one scaffolding, of that's truth, and it's just very exciting, because I don't think anybody ever, this is just something we're not taught to think about, that these things are connected. Science is connected to art. Science must talk to art. Science must talk to philosophy. And every time we have these discussions, it reminds me how much I was not thinking like this just a few years back. It's very special.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, first of all, I'm really happy that we're back in the same room, because there's definitely a different energy of discussing. I can tell that everybody has something they want to say, but then everyone's like, oh, maybe it's not my time. But you can feel the energy of discussion.
No, I was thinking.
Yeah, no, which it's really funny, because when we're... yeah, that too. How much we've matured. Oh yeah, just 1 year ago we all looked. Yeah, since last year we all looked. Yeah, last month. But something you said, Doc, that really struck me, and I feel like I didn't think about it in these terms, but I actually think gives importance to both the way we're gonna start doing a certain level of analysis, but ideological clarity in avant-garde, and how I feel like it relates to Nkrumah, and actually Henry Winston too, and Du Bois, is you framed it as, we were talking about Soros, where you said, who is in the vanguard of the ruling elite?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, I think the even better question was, why is it that young people today don't imagine the future the way someone like George Soros does? Because that's on purpose. But that's also why even the term avant-garde, because we know who the vanguard of the people need to be, the young people, the young generation. But why is it that they can't imagine the future the way that George Soros or Carl Schwab or Klaus Schwab and all these people can? And that's on purpose. And I had this conversation with a friend who used to be an ultra leftist in college, and it's cool because we were in some ways having some unspoken disagreements that made me really think about important questions like this, where he basically did not understand why I felt so much hope. And that was so interesting to me, because I was like, oh, but what about Trump? You don't have to agree with Trump, but isn't the presence of Trump exciting? Essentially the way, the political, because I'm so used to talking to you guys, I just am in a bubble of we're all, we can see movement. But how is it that someone like him, so smart, his entire dissertation is on war, technology and war. How is it that, he told me, he was like, I think if I'm going to be generous, there will be quote-unquote revolution in 40, 60 years. Right? But I'm not even talking in terms of time. I don't know if 40, 60 years is actually pretty short, or maybe it's long, but to me, it is the question of whether you're on a university campus or not. I feel like young people, there is a sense of they don't imagine, they don't have this, they don't imagine the future the way in such grand plan terms that someone like George Soros would, or when they look at the world, they don't see necessarily the same excitement or possibilities that, let's say, in free school, where at this point we're pretty used to seeing it as. And I was trying to ask why, and I just feel in general, the young generation has a feeling of I'm just gonna settle with what I have. I'm gonna settle for what I have, what I got, the best I can do. And I think that's kind of a big question or a big contribution that I think we're gonna make with avant-garde, which is I always use the word oxygen, and I know it's not necessarily the best word, but it is. I think there's something really important about contributing, being part of breathing oxygen back into people being able to imagine the future, or even be able to see right now as maybe not perfect, but as movement. And
Possibilities.
Yeah, possibilities. And I think that's what really astonished me about, because I had prepared all these notes for neocolonialism, and I don't know if I'll go in order, even though I had this whole plan, but at the end of the day, I think that is why Nkrumah's neocolonialism is so important, because he both explains first of all, Nkrumah to me is so similar to Henry Winston, the way he's thinking, and how important he thinks ideological clarity is. Because to be able to describe who the vanguard, what he's doing is he's trying to describe the logic, or like he's trying to describe the vanguard of the ruling elite and how they even came about. And at the same time, it's also him explaining why. He's like, and at the end of the day, like, the brilliance of the vanguard of the ruling elite is to divide and conquer. And then he explains why. And he explains not just the finance, but then he explains how somehow an economic strategy on behalf of the ruling elite has also consolidated like social, cultural, and psychological impacts. But then he ends by saying, and that is why unity, and he's like, and that is why the creative sword that heals that we have is a united struggle, and not just Africa, but a world struggle of people. Because I was thinking about it because my friend who I was talking to, like, honestly, I really enjoyed the conversation because he was like, I actually think that if we went to war with China, it might accelerate revolution in the US, right? Isn't that so interesting? And I said, no, I disagree, because even if we went to war with China, like, I was like, we would enter, because the people themselves are still like, we have not done our job, like, people have not done their job to help the people be in a place to even, like, you're ignoring basically the role of the people in all this. And if we were to go to war with China, like, that crisis is what we said last week, we would enter into fascism, where it's the ruling elite is still, like, has power enough that they would take advantage of that moment of crisis and to reorganize, like, society in crisis, under the guise of, like, okay, let's fix things. But then I was reminded of Nkrumah, because Nkrumah's whole point, and then yes, Du Bois, Henry Winston, King, they all said the same thing, which is, no, what makes the difference is that what you can do is you can build a united struggle, consolidate the people in a movement to prevent war.
Absolutely.
And for peace. But that's Nkrumah, and I know we haven't entered talking about neocolonialism yet, but yeah, that's why I also like avant-garde, because I do think in some ways, like, Nkrumah, and when you read him, it's so difficult because he's such a genius, and he has done something very universal. Like, he has, like, taken Leninism, which he takes very seriously, and made it more specific and more universal, and more concrete, the concrete universal. And I think with avant-garde, that's, whether we knew it or not, I feel like we are trying to be, like, emulate a certain type of, like, struggle for ideological clarity, which is, like, the first step to, like, in a great contribution to help the young generation, especially the people, in a moment like this. And I don't know, I see ourselves as, like, very much part of, like, following Nkrumah and thus Du Bois, because I think Nkrumah in a lot of ways is, like, he's really depends on Du Bois's framework. And at the same time, I also think it's us thinking like Henry Winston, who unfortunately people, especially leftists, do not take as seriously as he deserves. So.
I have a question. You raised I have a question. You raised something about the young people and about why. What is it, a crisis? You guys are here examining things and wishing for hope, which I think is admirable. But is it complacency? Because you said your friend talked about the war with China. Well, the war with China was certainly, cause people to do something. And you're talking, and we want to prevent that. But I think that the young people, with social media and all these other things, they don't have any crisis. Like if you're in a union, I'm not going to strike if everything is okay, right? So, how do you bring about that consciousness like you have here to get people to think? And so, if my material conditions are good, I'm partying, I'm going to see Beyonce, I'm doing all these things, and you guys talking this stuff here, I'm good. That's what I'm saying. You understand? So I'm asking you, since you deal and I teach college, I see, and a lot of times they don't have that you know, like, come on, let's do something. What is it? Well, anybody can answer. The crisis, you know, everything is good. To them, in my eye, you understand what I'm saying? If everything is good to me, then what you talking about?
Well, I was reading Lawson's book, Revolutionary Nonviolence.
Yeah.
And he talks about the crisis of war and Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
And the way Lawson talks about Black Lives Matter movement is different from the way we talk about it. But if I just take his view of the protests, most of the kids in Black Lives Matter protests were white, which is, a very insane contradiction. Why are all these white kids showing up? It's called Black Lives Matter. And we're also in a China, Cold War,
Right.
but unlike the previous Cold War, this Cold War, the economies are already interlinked, and now they're delinking. And I think the way I've been thinking about it, it's not really a Cold War; it's a cold Civil War in the U.S. And the way that the establishment always operates is it projects the internal situation to the external to deal with the contradictions. And I think that, when I first came to the free school, this is what I've been thinking about in response to Serafina. When I first came to the free school, Dr. Montero, you said, some people think that propaganda is a bad thing, but all propaganda means is to propagate ideas. And, why is it okay for George Soros to propagate ideas, but anytime anybody else wants to talk about ideas, it's a bad thing. And we have to be objective.
Yeah.
And so I think what Avant-garde is doing is we're propagating ideas. We're on the ideological offensive, but we're giving those white kids and
Pretty much any
the
kid.
black kids at the Black Lives Matter movement who are cathartically getting out their expression. We're giving them a language to operate in, or a language to discuss in, I don't want to make it academic, but Du Boisian framework basically. But without the framework, they can't take it to the next level.
I want to add to what you're saying about your book, your journal, Avant-garde. I often tell Tony that Doc, as you call him,
Tony to you.
that you guys represent sort of the concrete realization of the new American youth. In other words, struggle moves like, that struggle doesn't move like this, it moves like this. Right? So what I see when you use the term rupture, yes, it is a good term, because there is a, in our time, we went through integration with black and white. Like I said, when we grew up, we didn't see all these Indians and Chinese people, it was black and white, basically. So what I'm saying, in the process of time, you got that? And what you're doing here is listening to a black professor talk about history, etc. It's sort of like unifying, but particularly the respect for other cultures. That's very important. And we never had that before. That's an important movement, when you respect other people's cultures. And that's very unifying. And so that's the rupture that you can bring to the American people. That's it.
But I think, I was talking to my coworkers, and that's what they said when they were going on vacation, is that there were so many interracial couples that that it was basically, you couldn't tell what race the kids were.
Right.
And I think that the Asian, immigrant experience, all these kids are going to come in with confused identities in the next generation. I think that the Asian American experience will be important for them. Growing up, not in your motherland, in a country where everyone feels different. Maybe the majority, or at least the plurality of people, will be white. I think that the experience that most of the people in this room have growing up will be they'll be able to contribute significantly. And it's different from the way that you guys grew up, you and Tony. You and Dr. Montero grew up where it was more clean cut. But the other thing about propaganda is, propaganda didn't used to exist after war until World War II. After World War II is when you had propaganda in peacetime. And that order is collapsing. And I think that's the crisis that we're dealing with. It's not the US-China crisis. That's why, when we're talking about the youth, we're talking about the American youth, because I don't think the youth in other parts of the world have such a pessimism, because it's only the West that is in crisis. It's not the, as Du Bois would say, the darker nations.
If I could add to that, you used a word that stood out to me a lot. You said complacency, which I can see why you might interpret it like that, because you don't see the fire under their cushy that animates them.
Not like Malcolm.
which I would say is true, but I don't feel that it's complacency. I feel that there's a lot of young people that have a lot of aspiration who've been crushed, defeated. I'm sure you're gonna get a sense of these people at Penn in your reading group who are like dragging themselves through life, looking for one like little ray of light, which will be in the face of Korba, Nuri, and Michelle at first, and James Baldwin.
Yeah, I want to add to what I think Eddie is saying also, is that the crisis, when it manifests in young people, and you see it, because we were doing outreach or whatever, so we got to talk to some young people, and they're so bright and full of life. And the crisis comes, I think, not from just, this lack of, I think you were saying that the lack of crisis related to the material conditions of these young people. The crisis is more in it's a philosophical and psychological dimension, because it comes from knowing that there was a purpose for my life and it's unfulfilled. There's something that's deeply unfulfilling about the education that young people receive, also the role models that they are presented with to emulate, and ideas in general that they are, pushed towards as to automatically accept as being truth. So I think that is the crisis more than anything else. And you see young people struggling against this. You see them not giving up to believing that this is the only possibility my life can possibly have. And I think that is what makes this moment. And the other thing I wanted to say is, more than a consolidation of cultural point of views, I think what something like Avant-garde and Free School provides is a consolidation of ideas and possibilities for reaching, the potentiality that every child, every young person is born with. That we see in figures like Robeson and Du Bois, and striving. I think that is definitely, in my mind, the essential contribution that projects like this make, rather than more of a consolidation of, I guess, diverse opinions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Robeson actually. Because Robeson, in his youth, he was good at everything, right? He was a star football player, he could sing really well, he acted, he did all of those things. And I'll never forget this line in the documentary that we made. We consolidated little clips from everywhere. And there was this line which said that as his mantle of fame grew, the more radical he became. So I think that is the path that young people of today's generation sort of need to see, that you have to feel connected to more than just yourself and your family. You have to feel connected to the rest of society, the community, and then eventually the rest of the world. And that connection is lost. And I feel like Purva made an important point, which is that figures like Robeson are not role models of our time. That's why he had to be absolutely erased, and his personality had to be destroyed. Because you can't have a role model like him. You can have a role model like Elon Musk and George Soros, but their ultimate purpose, their aim, is accumulation of more and more resources and money and things, exploiting labor, but never to fight for something, never struggle for something. That's the idea that I feel that the youth of today have lost. That connection is really important, and I think that this is why avant-garde is something that is new, unique, and really necessary, because as Robeson said, the artist must make a choice.
Yeah.
The artist must have to take a side. And I think we are writing about and presenting our own artists who have made a choice, who've taken a side, and they're struggling for that choice.
Well, it's that. No, now you can go.
Okay, wait, a brief point I wanted to make is, I wanted to go back to this idea of the ideological offensive for understanding like the territory our work has been going into with, for example, avant-garde and reading back then. Because when we were talking about it earlier, I realized that I like that idea so much because I think it assumes that there's this assumption that the categories we've been given or the paths that we've been given are not entirely true, or that they're bankrupt, or that they've outlived their usefulness, which is something that we also talked about a lot this year, like this need for new categories. Because Doc, like, it made an impression on me when earlier you said Penn students at an elite university like Penn oftentimes aren't making a choice so much as having a choice forced upon them. And when you first said that, I actually was not sure if I would agree with you, because I've been in that position, and I do think that students make choices along the way that lead to, you know, who they become. But then I agree with you by the time you finished your statement, because you said the choices that are given are either you become a part of the ruling elite or you go crazy. And that actually hurt me when you said that, because I was sent to the edge of going crazy by challenging the consensus of the ruling elite. Well, because I personally was driven to the edge of being crazy by not even threatening so much as merely resisting, like, the elite paradigm at Penn. And that, yeah, like that anyway. This is why I like this idea of the ideological offensive a lot, because I actually think it's a nonviolent method where, yeah, where you're breaking the paradigm that's been set before you, and you're carving out a new possibility that changes, like, the system that you've been handed. You know, like, you transform yourself to transform the world. Because it also made me think about the way that Diane Nash had talked about going from north to the south, and how it was because of her upbringing in the north, and she was probably also very loved growing up, that made her see so plainly the injustice of segregation in the south. And that it would break her. Like, you know, there was no way she could accept that she was less than human being, like less than human. It's probably what her mother and her father taught her from day one, is that, like, she is worthy, like, she's loved, she's, you know, she will grow up to be something. And yeah, like, something in her was so strong, she could not accept those terms. She had to make new terms. And that's what I see us as doing. Like, it just made me realize her work, that's the nonviolent method. Like, what, yeah, anyway, you guys know. Like, Penn, avant-garde, yeah. But this thing of how desperately the ideological offensive is needed now, and then who is providing it? Like, who is providing ideas that don't already fall into the categories of, like, anti-neo-fascist, anti-Trump, like, black left? You know, that's the problem. You can read it like the back of your hand. They're stifling. Like, we need to go on the offensive. Yeah.
I know, on Thursday we met over at Eddie and Nathan's house, and to organize for the Winston event. And I remember, as I could do, I started talking, too much. But one thing I think Dwight will agree with me here, this time is very different.
Yes. Yeah.
From the time that we grew up and the time that Nkrumah wrote Neocolonialism. It is very different. And that's why you get a lot of people our ages who always want to talk about back in the days. As though back in the days has the answers for now. Which is another way of suggesting that you need not do anything.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Especially study this time. And I think, and I agree with you, Michelle. I think what the elite want is for the generation, first of all, they want, especially you all, whose parents are immigrants, to be so grateful that the white man has let you in.
Right, come on.
You know what I'm saying? That all you can do is serve him for the rest of your lives.
I know, right?
And okay, a lot of people can do that, but in the process they lose their soul. When you lose your soul, you lose your mind.
You do, yeah, yeah.
And that's why in elite universities, the epidemic of emotional and mental illness. And sometimes, if I could say this, sometimes it is easier to go the path of mental illness because you don't see the path of struggle. And I agree, this is very interesting. I'd like to discuss it more with you, Michelle. Are people making a choice? Is mental illness a choice that justifies a whole set of tactics, like running away from
Exactly.
your own responsibility to yourself? I mean, we can all go crazy. That's easy. You can easily go crazy. But there are things that you can do, but I would hope with other people. And this is why discrete organizations and people who stand for things. But, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's not an inevitability, but it is a choice at big universities like Penn. If it were not a choice, they wouldn't have all of the psychological counseling and all of that, where it ends up the person that's doing the counseling is more crazy than the person he's counseling. It happened at Penn where the head of psychological counseling jumped out of a window and committed suicide. Yeah, very famous case. So, but
Could I respond quickly to just say, I think this conversation is making me feel more and more strongly that what's going on at Penn is a very unique and important mirror for the American elite and the American crisis, but it's also a test of the capacity of the American people,
Absolutely.
or at least a subset of the American people.
Yes.
And
I would agree with you. And you had said this to me over a year ago, that there was potential there. And it's a specific project, of course. Penn is different than Lincoln University.
Well, yeah. Well, what I also realized through talking, but also when I was up north like a couple of weeks ago, I went to see Harvard and MIT and Brown, and it did remind me, the Ivy League institutions are different. And I'm not saying that there are not schools like Penn, but that Penn is distinctive for a lot of the reasons that we talked about before. The psychology of the Penn student is different from that of Harvard student. Like, there are just differences.
Yeah. I think what I would say is, in places like Harvard, Yale, Penn to a certain extent, the fiction, the narrative fiction that is fed to Penn students. Oh, you're the best. Oh, you're the future leaders of the world. Oh, you, woo, 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 you know? That's what's, so it's a fiction that life cannot support.
Yeah.
And it ends up ultimately in a crash for the individual. I don't care how much money you make, how secure you think you are, whatever, it's going to crash. And I don't think we experience this level of neuroses and separation and alienation of the human being from him and herself and others that he or she should be connected to. And I think one of the things that the Lotus Reading Group is going to do is to say, we are not alone. We don't all have to figure all of this out by ourselves. There's nothing wrong with us if we're sad sometimes, if we're uncertain sometimes, but in having a group of people reading a great thinker like Baldwin, we can hopefully work out what our future and the future of the planet will look like. And that's the optimism, and that's the hope. It's not a guarantee, but this, what I want to say, this is a different time. It is a different, the Cold War, Soviet Union, United States, okay. Soviet Union was nowhere on the level of the United States. Yes, there were great technological breakthroughs. Of course, they were more advanced philosophically. Ideologically, they were on the right side of history. But economically, they had been battered by World War II. 27 million people killed. In spite of that, they tried to continue to give to the lesser nations, the poorer nations of the world. In Vietnam, Cambodia with Prince Norodom Sihanouk, in Africa with Patrice Lumumba, yada yada, just a whole number of things. But the power of the collective West was so much, and it, so many opportunities for leaders to sell out, for coup d'etats to take place, and people say, well, let's just keep it moving. I was just in Nkrumah. There were only 8 or 10 million people in that country. Let's keep it moving, and so on and so forth. Today, there is the crisis of neocolonialism. China poses a competition, a opposition to the United States that they never experienced. China is the equal to the United States and surpasses the United States in terms of the solidarity and unity of its people, which means then that they can solve problems and contradictions in ways that this society cannot. This is a different time. And I think we all need the experience and the thinking of the younger generation. We need it badly because, what am I trying to say? We need the thinking of the young generation. One, because of its potential. I don't rule out the levels of education, although university education is not at all adequate to meeting the challenges of the young generation. All the things that young people think are very necessary at this time. Very necessary, because the world will be shaped by what you think and what you do. Dwight and I, we inherited a world already in movement, already in motion. By the time we get to Lincoln, Nkrumah's the president of Ghana, and he was one of the alumnus of Lincoln, so we're proud. Nnamdi Azikiwe was, by the time we get to Lincoln, already the president of Nigeria. So we're saying, oh, we got two great figures, you know, presidents that went to our college, you know. So if somebody came to Lincoln, let's say a black person came to Lincoln from Harvard, you know, I mean, you know, we never fought or anything, but we would curse them out and say, you need to go back where you came from, we don't need that here. I'm serious. We thought, at least I did, I don't know about everybody, but we thought we were the smartest student body in the country and the most revolutionary one. That's the way we looked at it. I mean, I think I looked at myself and my friends that way. So we wanted to study philosophy. We wanted to know Nkrumah, whether the white universities or the US government liked him or not. But we inherited a movement. By the time I get to Lincoln, Du Bois had just died. It was the March on Washington and the ascendance of King. You know what I'm saying? We inherited, we were the beneficiaries of it. Our inheritance is y'all's inheritance, but our experience is not a template for y'all. You all are, and I like the way you put it, you all are pioneering territory untraveled as this country is. And I'll just end on this. Nobody back in that days with the great Soviet Union, with the national liberation movements, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban, with all of that is positive, that would give you hope and make you positive. And we were. I mean, people who were just trying to get a law degree and make money, you know, they were looked down upon as bootlickers. Yeah. I mean, really, a person, oh, I'm just trying to make money, I'm just trying to do my thing. I mean, for us, we look down on them. And I still look down on them. You know, there's some, you don't know how badly they'll tell you, I don't even want to talk to them. They want to call me, please, forget my phone number. I'm sorry. But we look down on that type of ethos because the world of the oppressed and the oppressed were in ascendancy. And we felt, I felt, others felt, that we would ultimately win. We were on the cusp of winning. The world would win, but the US people would lag far behind. That's the way we felt. And that's, you know, that halfway explains a lot of the debates in the 70s and 60s over nonviolence, over King, over Malcolm, you know, whether King was a compromiser and Malcolm was uncompromising. All of these types of debates went on among us, you know, but the world that you all have inherited, and when we say it, when Avant-garde says it in the mission, is a more revolutionary world. It's hard to imagine. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, I could not imagine a world revolutionary process gaining any steam to speak of. You know, pretty much accepted, although, you know, grudgingly and a little bit depressive and so on. It was going to be a unipolar world. World Trade Organization, Bretton Woods agreements, the dollars, King, and all that. China was still in this rapprochement with the United States, which meant they said very little to oppose the United States. So, you know, I couldn't see it. And then suddenly, and I have to figure this out, maybe with you all, something happened in the early 2000s. You know, something happened. And 20 years later, we're seeing it congeal. into what is in essence a revolutionary or pre-revolutionary, to use Emily's mom's formulation, pre-revolutionary situation on a world scale. Okay, we can more or less accept that. But that the American people will play a decisive role, a political reconfiguration away from both major parties, a movement of people who most people, including me, could never have thought they would be this disruptive force, or that the American people are more united as a people than they've ever been. None of that had any empirical foundations or evidence for us. None of it. So you are, now, of course, like White myself, I saw the world then, I see the world now. As you know, I'm not all that into back in the days discussion, and I don't talk about people from back in the days, you know, I really don't. But this is a special time, a special moment for the American people. Even, and I'll end on this, even at the height of radicalism, the Cold War, all of the great leaders of Africa and Asia, you know, all that going on, Cuba, with Fidel. I mean, it's every, you know, just, there was so much to celebrate on a world scale, but not as much to celebrate in the United States.
Yeah.
Now, and this is a, Jerry and Michelle, y'all got it right. There is something to celebrate in the American people. There is some, okay, not a perfect people, you know? A country, like they say, I'm a citizen of a country that doesn't yet exist, which is another way of saying I'm a citizen of the world. Citizen, question of citizenship, you know? A country that doesn't yet exist, but I'm a citizen, which means that my citizenship, my loyalty is to a vision. And I mean, I could see it in the free school, which I think is a paradigm of the future. You know, people can, you know, use the image of Du Bois and talk about Du Bois, this and the other. But in Philadelphia, the concrete form of Du Bois's thinking is in the free school. So if you're not doing the free school or something like the free school, you need to just, you know, chill. I put it that way to be kind, because you're not doing shit but distorting Du Bois. But you all, it is something, and the way you all think, this world house that the free school is, at one time, I would have thought it was an anomaly, unworkable, doesn't fit Philly. I'm convinced of the opposite now, that it fits Philly and it fits this country because we are citizens of a country waiting to be born. Which means, it's very emotional to talk about, which means our loyalty is to a vision, to ideas. And anyone in a time like this who is not committed to great ideas, a great vision, is condemning the people they say they're fighting for to all kinds of neuroses. You know, neuroses means alienation, separation from community, from people, from family. Free school says, no, there's a way out. There is a way to unity. There is a way to do this. And we try to be a living, breathing example of the way it can be done. the way it can be done.
I guess something this conversation has made me think about is the role fear seems to play in the development of young people and most generations in this country. It just seems like if your life is dictated to by fear exclusively, that you have no real way of growing. And so in a way, this whole sort of degrowth idea that we're given as a future, which is pull back from industry, we have to have a greener economy that's based on slowing production, slowing building industry. It just seems like from so many different angles, young people are really told that you should be afraid of the environment being destroyed. We have 2-3 years now, or 5 years tops, to survive this catastrophe. You've got the impending doom of the wars that are ever present around us, not to mention all of the immediate violence that's right in front of us as we try to walk down the street. And it seems like that more than anything, I think, prevents us from actually looking deeper into the pain that we feel. Because, like Baldwin says, when we look into that pain, we can ignore it, we can come to terms with the fact that it can unite us with one another. It helps us see each other in a very real way. Now, it's a difficult thing to do, especially if you're paralyzed by fear. But to really actually begin to process the uncertainty around us in a positive way requires hope. And that's something King says. King says hope isn't just this sentimental wish. It is really an essential tool for envisioning and beginning to start the process of organizing a new way to live your life and society as such. And I don't know, my niece just started going to kindergarten, and one of the new policies this year was that parents are not allowed anywhere on the premises at any time. They're not supposed to meet the teachers. Like me and my brother went to pick her up from school, and they didn't want us there. You can go in car, because there's like a drive-through type of situation, but they don't want any interaction with any potential unsupervised adult. And to me, that's clearly an indication they're terrified of anything that might happen to the kids from someone they may not know. But what are you inculcating in the child if to get into any room you got to put a password in, or many schools now have shooting tests, shooting drills to. Because everything is on this notion of how do I avoid dealing with the problem of the community, because that is what it is. And the only way out is to try to look around us and see that there is no way around this fear. There's only through. There's no way to just kind of avoid this menace that is the fear that surrounds us. Is our inability to see one another in a very real way. And of course, it's interesting in the time we're in where most of the rest of the world is seeing the light. They're seeing this way, this system of things that's predicated on fear and subjugation and dictation, or dictating this fear around the world, crumble. And it is hard because we live in this society, so we are impacted by that fear. That I feel weighed down by the people around me and my life included. Like there's no way to avoid it. So how do we begin to reckon with the fact that this system is unsustainable, and why are we so attached to this? Why is it that we're so? Do we really want freedom? That's another thing. Is this really what we're interested in?
I have a lot to say, but we'll talk. It's such. So I don't think there's one answer, one antidote to all of the ideological, psychological ills of American society. The trauma that people are experiencing, take in a city like Philadelphia, just knowing, to the extent that people do know, that there is a Kensington, which is not just a blight upon the city of Philadelphia and a disgrace, but a shame upon the nation. There's poverty all over the world, but no other society in the world has a Kensington. Why is it that not as poor, let us say, as parts of India, but they don't have Kensington? You know, and people from India that see Kensington find it unbelievable and can't explain it to people back home that this rich country is like this. I think if I were to say what would be the decisive activity for revolutionaries at this point, it is the ideological struggle. Doesn't solve everybody's problem. It doesn't solve everybody's problems in the free school, I've come to find out.
But it helps.
Yeah, but it sure enough helps, man, in a big way. Won't solve every problem, but it will create conditions for the solving of the major problems of a society. And I think patience, it's not going to be an overnight thing. And I just want the free school people to be safe, to be present. You know, don't walk around a city like Philadelphia looking up in the air. Know where you are. That people in the free school develop a high discipline. It's very important, and that we fight to preserve our unity and improve it. And there's every reason to not be united all the time. Many people would like to see the free school be undone. But I think those are the things I would say. But the ideological struggle, and that's what is different between back in the days, as they say, and now. Really, it is the difference. Because, you know, we didn't have to be so ideologically developed and sophisticated. And most weren't. But now, it requires that. The moment requires that. Because I think the system will crack on the point where it's most vulnerable is at the ideological, where they think they are strongest. But that's, I think, their weakest point. And what we see, and this is why the Trump thing cannot be, this is where Cornell is showing his vulnerabilities and weakness. He was great on the college campuses. He was great as a lecturer, as a speaker. But now you're going up against the ruling class, and all of the vulnerabilities ideologically have become apparent as, and you have the wrong, just the categories that he's speaking through and thinking through don't fit. And we talked about this in the study of pragmatism, you know? But yeah, the ideological struggle is the great contribution, and it is the contribution of the free school. I know people have said, come to a conference and said, well, now that you have told us all, well, are you going to tell us what to do? Well, excuse me, I told you what to do. You've got to educate your damn self so that you can educate your constituency.
Right.
Handing out food once a week is not enough. I mean, that's virtue signaling. But what do you say to the people you're giving food to? Because they need food of the mind, too.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
What do you say to them?
Yep.
And frankly, there's very little that most of them have to say. Because they're interested, they think it's going to be some immediate solutions, and it ain't going to happen that way. It's not, but yeah.
Well, just on that thing about Kensington, real small. It's interesting that you say it again, because it makes me think of, well, why Isn't there a Kensington everywhere?
Yes,
Because
all over the world.
a Kensington only existed because people go to do drugs to Kensington. Like
Right,
people
right.
are actively choosing to go down there. Once it was a community, it was deindustrialized. And you know, there's been poverty in a city like Philadelphia, Chicago, that is interlinked with violence. There's always been that. But the use of drugs and also the trade and the culture of drugs also means that there's something ultimately suicidal about a people. Like people who want to go and who have given up to a certain extent.
That's right.
You know, they've given up, they have families, they have something to fight for, but it's not enough. Or it's like they are so down bad that it's the only thing that they can, or I could be able to see as something that gives me meaning, is ultimately like just a essential chemical reaction in your mind that makes you feel a certain type of thing, and that a rush, you need that. But then also walking amongst people or amongst a neighborhood who don't have limbs, or who don't
have what?
like limbs, or like,
limbs.
you know, then what happens to the city? What happens to the country? But like, I think that when you mentioned that to me, I thought about why people go down there. Because to the whole conversation about, the whole conversation we're having about the crisis, really, and the struggle for ideology, the ideological struggle, meaning like the struggle for the mind, for the human being,
Right.
It means that there's something that's been festering also, that the ruling class has kind of unleashed among the American people, which is ultimately suicidal, and would rather the American people die than for people to struggle, which is also something that whether that be the university student or like anybody, really people have that quality. And that's also why like there's that, with young people, or I could just say, I'm just speaking for myself, like there's an urgency in myself because I know that it's a do or die scenario. But
Could you explain that, a do or die?
it's like, because to me, why do anything at all? Or like, why aren't there more people with me from the city? Like, I know people who make art who have a whole nother culture and a whole nother life world and everything like that. But why do this? Why choose to do this? Because it's still a matter of the essential questions for me. Like, it's still a matter of like, well, what is the cost of everything? Because I know coming up, I'm only speaking. I know. I don't mean to speak general, but I kind of speak general, not to say the specific realities in my life that brought me to preschool. But I think that with young people, there always needs to be a possibility, at least, or to see that there's a future, at least, because
You say at least.
yes, because
At least.
we don't remember Paul Robeson, like Shantanu was pointing out. We don't know the qualities of the history of struggle, meaning the reality of it, what it meant for the American people, and its ultimate effect on our consciousness. And it's a question about even thinking about how we think. More so than is it a question about what exactly it is that we're doing as young people. Why do we do what we do, and why do we see the options that are in front of us? Because it's an interesting thing that you say, Doc, that this time is qualitatively different, because that's exactly what I was thinking. Why is it qualitatively different? And then why is it that there is a shift? There's that shift that you're talking about in the early 2000s. Whether that be because of the financial crisis, or Obama, or China, or whatever, at the end of the day, the civil rights movement had still laid an effect on the world. At the end of the day, the Communist Party, or whatever, that there's an effect on the consciousness, on the, and like the thought, we're talking about thought, whether that be about science or whatever, like there's unresolved questions that need to be resolved. But how do we also get to the core of answering these questions? Why is it that we cannot, and we seem to find anything else to do with our time that really doesn't really take up anything besides time? We waste it. And no, because I had similar conversations this week about how I have a feeling that people don't see the future. Like there's a quality that's missing. Mm-hmm. That's because of our relationship to the future, to the world, to ourselves. We don't have a healthy relationship. There's a dishonesty, a lack of love that we have in that relationship, whether that be with ourselves, towards other people. There's a lie with everything that we tell, that we would have to tell to manage in a certain way in this time. And then another thing that makes me think of is how many times I've been saying throughout the past couple of weeks about people telling me that I've been around, which is just maybe between their early 20s to 30s, that they're okay with the world ending. Total just, like it's fine. So what led you to believe that? Number one. And number two, why is it that I don't see that at all whatsoever? But I know that at a certain point in my life, I could have. But so the cost, there's a big cost because of what you're saying about propaganda. And
Did you say cause or cost?
I said there's a big cost of human life
Cost, yeah.
to the result of this kind of attack, this kind of, but the suicidal aspect is consistent throughout, and I think all of us probably in this room have experienced it. So,
that's interesting.
Anyway.
Yeah, to add to what you were saying, a couple of days ago I was driving and I saw this young black man, and I saw the shirt, like the words on the back of his shirt, and it said, "Make money, not friends." and actually it made me really sad, because it's exactly what you were saying, which is what led you to wear that shirt, and in essence what led you to believe that. So, and then the other part is how does this impact this child? And I don't think it's uncommon in our society to that thread of thought. I think in any society it's really difficult to educate young children, or educate a society, not even just children. Again, I think like Brandon and Chanda probably could attest to that. But I think what's happened in American society is that there is an education that's happening not happening within the classroom, but also outside the classroom. And that's also what many teachers are facing, which is that as they're for the teachers that are trying to educate the children in their class, they see that there's also so many forces outside of the classroom that makes it extremely difficult. And it's not just the subject itself of like math or science or history, but also how to like, be a human being and navigate American society. And I think that's also where many of us, as children of immigrants or immigrants ourselves, didn't know how to navigate the society, where our parents didn't know. But that's also why the free school and also even the Nation of Islam providing providing an education that espouses the values and history that is not being taught. And so it's like when I saw that, I think he's probably like late teens, early 20s, he has a life ahead of him. And if he lives the rest of it, I mean, he faces this question, which is, do you go insane or do you make money, not friends? But the contradiction was he was with the other kids too, so I don't have friends. So he had friends.
He had friends. And no money.
Well, this is actually something I was thinking a little bit about, like for a while in our conversation. I've yet to think of formulated, but when I hear all these stories of young people, like already so willing and ready for the world to end or to be complacent with how it is, or to not feel excited about the times and the fact that there's all these new elements arriving on the scene that make the world dynamic and therefore give more possibilities, and to even want to understand that but instead withdraw. I feel like the thing that came to mind for me was that I feel like when I first learned about the concept of the end of history, like the Francis Fukuyama thesis, like I was like, oh, that can't be. This seems really, that seems so pessimistic. Like, come on, that's so silly. But the fact is, I feel like even if you know or don't know it, that thinking is already the thinking of the ruling elite, because that's already accepting that like there is no more struggle. Therefore, what the West, the unipolar world, what you were saying, Doc, the experience that you must have had, or those who lived through that time, like thinking that, okay, like that's the highest like form that human development has achieved, Western liberal democracy, endless wars, this like, whatever this I know we've been talking about like the economic situation for many, many weeks now. I'm losing the words to even grasp it, but it is like this, like the dollar hegemony, all of that, like it should stay that way. And like then the ruling elite can do whatever it wants with it. And it's surprising, but actually kind of also the paradox that young people, like that is all that we have known. And obviously these new, like the way I'm sure in the early 2000s, like people I think naturally started to feel, I think, or like maybe the rest of the world started to feel with these endless wars, the financial collapse, everything, all those promises that weren't probably even true in the first place weren't kept up. And then I think that it is also still a shame that in this moment, young people aren't like, well, the end of history sucks. We should be thinking about a future. It's still something that I feel like that's why we do what we do, to re-inject that sense of history, because it hasn't ended. There's actually so much of a future to be made, and that was totally different than the way it seems like in your time, like people were thinking about like a birth of a new world. That is why I feel like when I was thinking about what Dwayne was saying about like, yes, like the free school has achieved something, or like today's generation has achieved a sense of respect for other cultures. I was thinking to myself, you know, that was also something that in like the World Youth Festivals, or even like the way like John Coltrane and all these jazz musicians, they were also not only witnessing the birth of a new world order, they were very much ready for it and studying all these different cultures. I feel like that was achieved. It's actually something higher. We're trying to not stay at the ground floor here. We're trying to get to the penthouse. The penthouse being like, let's go forward, let's go higher. which I was like, but then I was like, what is that? It is also the vanguard, like creating a vanguard, like ideological consolidation around being the pioneers of a new world, the Afro-Asiatic configuration. And I was like, what is that? What is that? And it's like being united, like being ready to contribute what your civilization has, you know, been able to brought, but also yeah, be able to refashion or reimagine the world, a new world based on peace, based on democracy, like a people's democracy, based on love. And I mean, yeah, also when you were speaking, I was thinking about like, King also quotes, what is it, perfect love casted out fear.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it.
Say that again.
How do you say, perfect love casted out fear. I was just thinking, like, I think that I feel like this is what was hard in my article, because I feel as if this conversation is helpful, because I was saying to you this morning that I want to be able to write this article about how North Philly, as poor as it was in the 60s, there are still gangs, there is still violence, there's still just like poverty, there are still schools, churches, nightclubs, like of the black proletariat that fostered all of these geniuses who contributed to the world movement. But we don't have those anymore because of deindustrialization. We don't have them anymore because of the disinvestment. And what you're saying as well, Serafina, like the ideological attack on what those institutions, those people's institutions, fostered in young people. And I was like, this is a really pessimistic article. I need to find something. And then our conversation today was great, because it was like, actually today there is a lot of revolutionary potential. What you were saying, that Archie's vision of a new world might be coming to fruition in ways that he might not have imagined. I just have to sit with that, because I do think there's a lot of potential in the rest of the world, and how that will be achieved in this country is something I feel like, I mean, it's hard, but that's actually why we're trying to do it. That's why we're getting together every Saturday and all the other reading groups and trying to do all this, because it is something we're all trying to actively work out. But I just think that's true, that it's almost easier to accept that it's the end of history, but actually what's really important is to know that it hasn't stopped, and this is why we're always talking about time, I feel like, with every preschool, and that, time,
and
well, like that people seek the advancement of history, and to be agents of history, and that the ruling elite is always seeking to pause it, and that's what the end of history is supposed to represent. But that, like, even when you pause, you can see that it's highly distorted, it's a highly stagnant time, and like to live through. And I think it's clear people don't really want this, but it's a whole nother choice to commit yourself to actually moving history forward.
Yeah, we should first do comments. There are many.
Pass the napkins.
You want some napkins?
We should read the ones that make sense.
So, Stephen Palmier said the discipline.
Speak up a little bit more.
Okay. Lots of people say good morning. Neha, BK, Christopher Romero, Stephen Palmier, Philip Logan, Magna, Jacob, DJ Al. Stephen Palmier says the discipline required to publish Avant-garde will deepen and expand the agency of free school. Congratulations on producing this auspicious effort. BK, I don't remember which part of I think it was to Dwight's question at the very beginning about, I guess, young people and complacency. He thought that was a good, interesting question. But I think when Alice and everybody was responding about like multiculturalism versus, I think, something new, BK said, or maybe new identities will be defined and established. People are adjusting to the owl again. Where they're adjusting to the owl, like the layout and how it looks. Because where Pilgrim says, I must say, this cryptic visual presentation is very interesting. Because it's like 3 panels.
Oh, okay.
Magna had commented on Facebook, Jahan and I went to an event documenting the Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers in 1969. The panelists, who were two senior Black liberation activists, spoke of what a great moment of unity that festival was, and how it's too bad that we don't really have examples of revolutionary struggle today, parentheses, except for the climate change struggle. And so she says, sometimes it feels like very few people see what we see and are completely led by the narrative of the elite without knowing it. And this is what contributes to the feeling that Michelle and Doc described as going crazy. The fact that our belief in the capacity of the people makes us see this moment for what it is, and that's what makes what we're doing important and avant-garde. And Taylor Birch commented, it's very interesting, she said, therapist here, mental illness is indeed a choice/defense. We go, no, but it's really, like, we go mentally ill when there's something before us that feels harder and more painful to face than the mental illness itself. And
That's
so,
what I'm saying.
and then BK.
Could you read that again?
Yeah.
There's something before us.
Okay,
When
so.
there's something before us.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It is a choice and a defense because we go mentally ill when there's something before us that feels harder and more painful to face than mental illness itself. So the choices are mental illness or really facing reality.
That's right.
And truth, which is painful and difficult.
And she says it's a choice and a defense.
Yeah, choice
That's
slash
very
defense.
interesting.
And so then BK asked, is it a conscious choice or a reaction or reflex? And Taylor responded, it's more of an unconscious choice. Like, it's not even on the level of like, because I think the thing is that I don't think most people see it for themselves as my choices between going crazy or facing it. I think they just naturally feel that basically they don't have a choice. Because I think that's why also we had that reaction when she said it is a choice.
Well, the thing is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the role of a therapist oftentimes is to bring them to face that reality. Like, what is it that they haven't worked through? But then oftentimes therapists are not equipped to deal with the problems of society that are impacted. So,
I think it ties to what you were saying about that these people, they're unable to visualize the path to struggle. So in essence, they can only see one path, and that is the path down which they encounter mental illness and neuroses and isolation. And your analysis is right, the therapist's job is to show them that no, you have these other doors, there are other options, there are other paths that you can walk down. And I think that the major movement on the opposite side is to reduce visibility of this path to struggle.
But then Taylor added, like, mental illness is basically how many people survive things that are too painful for us to face. And to go with what Doc is saying, but you do it alone.
You do,
and
all of it is.
But I think that's the really sad thing, which is that so many people are just surviving in this life, like barely getting through, like what Kathy, you were saying, which is that you're on the ground, like you aren't even on the ground level, like you're just like lying down and you're just trying to get through life. But I think that's why the ideological struggle, like everybody has been saying, is so important, because that's like both, like it reveals reality, where reality is not just pain, but there actually is a path through it, and that actually that reality contains possibilities. Like it's the only real open door, because mental illness and like that path is like one, like people have been saying, non-struggle, but also it takes you further from reality. And then EK said, this makes sense. There are very common expressions of this, like both subtle and like functional, where people have like some aspect of it, but are more like visibly functional. And that it's very intriguing. Christopher Romero said, a person might be there physically, but in the mind or spirit, that person is dead unless they're brought back to life. The modern pop and party-obsessed culture is a reflection of this. Just drink and have a good time, but remember you'll have to go back to that work week at the end of the weekend. So just enjoy it. So the actual process of living, the majority of the week, is drudgery, while the small amount relegated to enjoyment is filled with the desire to leave the world in and of itself, like escapism. And he says that's outright suicidal.
Beyonce.
Yeah.
Beyonce.
Yeah. And then, BK agrees with Christopher Romero. And then Theo Henrik says, this is the first time commenter, I think. They say, love the intellectual discourse from the folks here. Shout out from the Philippines. It gives me hope. It gives me hope that the American people aren't lying down hopeless amidst all the adversities. It gives me hope to also do our part here in my country to help people realize a higher stage of class consciousness.
Todd Doherty. See Todd Doherty?
Oh, I think Todd said good. He shared and said good. Wait.
No, it says speaking to the end of history.
Oh, it's on Facebook.
You should read it. Oh, you read it.
I can't find it.
Speaking to this end of history, the recent Dr. Cornel West interview with Jimmy Dore triggered a fixed binary conversation. One side suggesting that white supremacy has ended and is no longer.
He's talking about Jimmy. I don't know how many people saw that interview.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of fiasco on each side.
Yeah.
But Jimmy Dore trying to make the class argument by denying race and white supremacy. But I don't know whether we want to say anything about that, but it's gotten a lot of attention.
It'll all be solved by Kwame Nkrumah. No worries.
You see the rest of what he said?
Finished. He said, it's no longer ... relevant. Okay, so one side suggesting that white supremacy has ended and is no longer relevant. The other, that our neighbor is a white supremacist. How do we use James Baldwin in The Last White Nation to speak to each side of the false binary?
False binary.
Yeah, we can put the neocolonialism. Well, I feel like we kind of segued into it earlier, but I actually think our conversation about the conversation that kind of just spontaneously, organically happened out of talking about Avant-garde and the Henry Mason Symposium and then Lotus, and then now talking about specifically Kwame Nkrumah's work, neocolonialism, and all the concepts he talks about and why I think it's relevant for today. I think it's actually an extension from last week's Free School about the theory of the state. But I wanted to first just talk about Kwame Nkrumah, and I think other people are also, because so many people I think are reading neocolonialism, not just in our Avant-garde reading group, but even in Vietla Kamai. So I wish that Brandon and Chanda could have been here early. I wish that they could have said something as well about their reading. But I first wanted to talk about Kwame Nkrumah and how, in some ways, when you were talking about how you and Dwight, you were in a time where you inherited a movement, like a world in motion. And it kind of made me also think about how I found it kind of weird at first how much I resonated with Nkrumah, because, he's seen as this great Ghanaian leader, African leader, but actually when he talks, I feel like he could be, like, you could put yourself in his shoes. And I think part of it is also because he was intentionally doing something that our generation has to do deliberately today as well, which is take, like for Nkrumah, neocolonialism is him taking what he feels was a very important theoretical, basically an important theory, which is Leninism, Lenin's theory of imperialism, and trying to build upon it and actually make it more concrete or specific or universal to a very important time. And so he's doing something deliberate that I feel like I really resonated with when I was reading Nkrumah, even though I don't think I understand all the concepts he's going deep into in his work, Neocolonialism. But he wrote Neocolonialism, I think, in 1967, 9?
It was published in 65.
Oh.
So you may have been working on it since the early 60s.
Oh, okay. So it's in the 60s.
As a practical task of understanding the difficulties that Ghana and other West African nations face in economically development.
Right, because it's in his third chapter, Imperialist Finance, where he says, he addresses the fact that he's building on Lenin's theory of imperialism, the highest or last stage of capitalism, but more specifically state monopoly capitalism. And because he says Lenin, for example, Lenin is also talking from a period of World War I, where Lenin is talking about how imperialism, he's trying to explain World War I as like where the imperialist powers, the basically state monopoly capitalist imperialist powers are engaged in such rife competition that it leads to World War I, where it's not really a world war, it's a war of imperialist powers trying to redivide the world according to certain resources. But Nkrumah is speaking, he's speaking, like you're saying, a practical task of the 60s, well, even before that, where it's after World War II, there are changes happening economically, but thus it has huge direct ramifications for all these newly independent countries, especially in Africa. And even at that time that Nkrumah is writing, there are still countries in Africa fighting for independence. And so he's trying to, in some ways it's also him trying to work out something theoretically and practically, because in some ways it's a warning. He's trying to provide a warning to African countries saying, like, be careful, because and he is arguing in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Yeah, Neocolonialism, last stage of imperialism. He's trying to explain where in the imperialist powers have had to pivot their strategy. And that is very important for revolutionaries in Africa, but even the world, but especially Africa, to beware of this, and for them to be ideologically clear and thus prepared practically to maintain, like, fight for independence even after achieving, like, independence from colonialism. And so I just wanted to first address that, because in some ways, so Nkrumah had spent some years in America at Lincoln University, and I think he got a master's at Penn. He had spent his summers like working on the docks and at factories, and he had seen also, must have gotten to know the American situation, especially the African American struggle or the Black freedom struggle, the Black proletariat. And of course he must have read Du Bois, because to me, I see Nkrumah's neocolonialism as him using Du Bois to complete and practically make universal Lenin's general theory. And I think it's because Nkrumah, I think it's not coincidental that Nkrumah is an African. And Nkrumah, also he spent time in America, but also Nkrumah is speaking from the standpoint of the African freedom, like anti-colonial movements. And like, he does something that Lenin does not, and it's very important, because I think this is what makes it universal for the world, including the American people. But Nkrumah is talking about how it's after World War I, and he spends like all these chapters, we haven't finished the book yet, but he spends all these chapters describing how after World War I, he wants to explain how there became an American dollar, like what happened to the US dollar, why like the US dollar changed or was produced, and a new world system around that, world market system, like how US dollar hegemony came to be, even over Europe, which is the old powers, the old imperialist powers. But then he also makes a point to say it is because of the anti-colonial struggles after World War II that forces the imperialists to change their strategy. He introduces this concept that when something like that happens, where these countries have defeated colonialism, and now in some ways a new stage of the world is being born, a vacuum is produced. And it is that time of a vacuum where it becomes very important like what because the imperialists are going to change their strategy, and Nkrumah is basically saying, are we going to also be prepared for that vacuum? Because he's saying we're in the middle of that vacuum, and we have to he's basically like, we have to get a move on because they're coming for us. And he describes that the way they're coming, the way these imperialist powers, especially a rising U.S., which wasn't hurt as much through World War II, like the European nations. He says it is the U.S. that is, in particular, is consolidating with Europe to introduce a new form of colonialism while also declaring independence, like declaring support for independence, which is neocolonialism. It's a new way of trying to continue colonialism, except under different means. In some ways, it's a more creative strategy, and it's a very finance, economic-based strategy. And I think Jeremiah Neri can explain it better, like the dollarization, U.S. dollar and stuff. Okay, but yes, and Nkrumah also makes the point when he describes the rise of the U.S. He also says, and that is why Korea happened. That's why the Korean War happened, and it's why the Vietnam War happened. Because here you have a new power and using a new strategy, neocolonialism, where the US, it's not just a policy decision to go to Korea or Vietnam. What they're doing is they are in pursuit, because it is finance, like a new type of finance, capitalism on a world scale, they will do whatever it takes to find new markets and also find new strategic materials. And also, Nkrumah says, and the fact that the Soviet Union exists is also a very important challenge to a neocolonial power like Nkrumah. But if we as Free School want to fill in the gaps, a lot of things happened after Nkrumah that he was unable to write about, which is, after the fall of the Soviet Union, now imagine this reckless financial system belonging to a few hands. What then happens? Okay, what do I want to say? Okay, but anyways, to cut straight to the point, even though I have a lot of notes, I just wanted to say that I think Nkrumah's neocolonialism is the main way we can make the case of something Free School has been saying, which is that the crisis of neocolonialism around the world is intertwined with, but also the same crisis of the ruling elite in the US. Which is why, for example, my friend who I was talking to yesterday, it explains why some people get so excited about, Africa, or excited about the rest of the world, but then how can you be excited about Russia and China or even BRICS, but not see it as intimately connected and intimately connected with the political rebellion of what's happening in the US? Or not see, for example, let's just say the crisis of the US dollar, which again, I cannot fill in the blanks because I think some of my colleagues are better suited to that, but the crisis of the US dollar today is it is both a world thing, but also helps explain the political rebellion today in the US. And Nkrumah makes the point by saying anything that is happening in Africa is intimately tied with whatever is happening to the American people, and it's all controlled by the same few hands that have consolidated, in particular in the US. We don't know the details because it's so shadowy and kept from us, but there are very few hands controlling the lives of 1.5 billion people. 1 billion people. US workers their wages are kept down, they experience inflation, they have been industrialized, they've been told, don't worry, we'll give you a 1% raise next year, it'll all be okay. And then at the same time, countries in Africa have been kept imprisoned because when they were newly freed, when they were independent, they were forced for various reasons to be dependent on Western currency. And once you're dependent on Western currency, you are forever bound either politically, socially, culturally to Western nations. Okay, so that's kind of the main point I wanted to make, because I think Nkrumah's neocolonialism also helps make it clear why the American people are play such a decisive role, not just for this country, but even in aid or in parallel or hand in hand with whatever is happening in both Africa, what happens in Africa, but also the rest of the world. Because at the end of the day, BRICS plus 6, like the world is already like also themselves committing to de-dollarization and finding new alternatives, realigning. And it's very important for Americans to listen to Nkrumah and understand the American people's decisive role in essentially seeing that the state, which Nkrumah calls the invisible government, he says there's an invisible government that is controlling like the world financial system, has all these African and Asian countries and Latin American countries in their pockets and will forever be interested in war. For as long as there's neocolonialism, there will always be war. And he's saying that it is up to the American people to be able to see the invisible government. Like they have a decisive role to play today, or this is me talking now, decisive role today to take a stand or to be able to see and, struggle against this invisible government, which I find interesting because Nkrumah called it an invisible government, but I actually think today we would call it in free school. It's no longer, maybe it was an invisible government back then, but at this point it's so consolidated that it is a state. It is the state, where the state no longer can be assumed to be democratic, and that it doesn't matter how many elections are held, like we said last week, the state itself is no longer democratic. And so now, just like the Declaration of Independence said, when the time comes where the people have a right, when the state itself is no longer democratic, for the people to democratize it, to take power, to seize state power, and that can be seen, and that's seen, that the state is not democratic. That can be seen, for example, we've talked about it over and over again. It's seen in the fact in a city like Philadelphia, such low turnout, where elections don't mean anything, because the state is no longer democratic. I think that was what I wanted to say. But yeah, and then I wanted to turn it to Alice or Jeremiah, if you want to build on.
Yeah, I think it's extremely significant to point out that Nkrumah knew Du Bois and Du Bois knew Nkrumah. And both were aware of the American situation and also the importance of Africa to the world. Because as Nkrumah is talking about Ghana and also the African situation in the world, Du Bois has also written The World in Africa, meaning what is the role Africa is to play in world affairs. And I think that's also where the bunch of us started to study Nkrumah and also various African leaders, because we're trying to understand this moment. People are talking about Africa, but there's also any counter-revolutionary significance that is placed on Africa. But the reason why Nkrumah and Du Bois come together is that they see that there are revolutionary trends in Africa that are emerging from the people, and specifically with World War I and World War II, both attribute the wars to a crisis in capitalism. And many of us aren't as familiar about Africa before, where you hear about some duke is assassinated and that's how the whole war World War started. But they talk about what exactly is the reason for these world or Western wars in the division of Asia and Africa, where they talk about what exactly is capitalism? Why is capitalism connected to war? In the sense of, when the first originators of this theory of capitalism envisioned it, it was essentially competition and free markets. But the incentive of capitalism is to make profits. And so you end up in a stage where you want to eliminate competition for increasing profits. And that's where you get the world wars amongst the different European powers. And that's, I think, building upon what Emma was saying, as Ghana emerges out of the liberation struggles following the 2 world wars, Ghana being important because it not only is part of Africa in a sense of commodities, raw materials such as cocoa, and I don't know if it has specifically minerals, but it is also a center. It was a center of the slave trade. But with the independence of Ghana, or independence of Ghana in 1957, he's witnessing the world shifting, as Emily was saying. And in our group we talked about this concept of form and content, where that's even why Neo is tagged to colonialism, because it's the same thing, which is that in name these African countries are sovereign or making their own decisions, but it isn't, because of political and economic balkanization that happened prior. And this is the concept of keeping these African nations that are only 1 million into these we've been talking about this non-viable state. And it has been difficult to understand exactly for this reason, which is Africa itself is complex, but the reason why these nations, all these different nations were formed, was for the purposes of division by Britain, by France, all of that. That's where it becomes important to understand your current times. Because as we were reading neocolonialism, I kept thinking about this concept that we talked about a couple of months back, which was Kondratyev's Russian political economist, of this long wave theory of economics, but also of political theory, where this is happening or the independence movements are happening, or anti-colonial movements are happening in the 1950s, 60s, but they're brutally crushed. Where Nkrumah is overthrown in a coup. You also see the assassination of various leaders in Africa. But then at this time, you see the rise also of, what's happening in Niger, and these African states abstaining from voting on sanctions against Russia. And so I think it's like what Tony Doc was saying earlier, it's unclear what's happening, what has happened in between, but you see a connection, which is something these liberation movements happened in the 50s, 60s, but then something's also happening now with the formation of BRICS that reminds us of those times. And so, one, how do you make sense of that? And it is significant because when we're talking about neocolonialism and the crisis of neocolonialism, who is the greatest neocolonial power in our times? And it's what's happened, and it's the US. And so a crisis and I think we talked about this last week too, which is a crisis in this state is a crisis of the super state, which means the state that has ruled the world since the Cold War. And I think that's why so the chapter within the book, The Truth Beyond the Headlines, actually I don't know how many headlines are talking about BRICS nowadays, but essentially at that time, the way Nkrumah used this title is that at that time there was this formation where many of these European banks were being essentially brought under the American wing, or American banks in domination. But in the headlines, it's not clear. It doesn't say it that explicitly what the implications are, but the implications being that through American financial hegemony, we're also impacting many of these decisions and policies that are made in European banks. And both are also influencing the policies that are going on, industrial policies in Africa, meaning, is the agricultural sector being developed, or is it the industrial sector that's being intentionally kept underdeveloped in Africa? But that's why BRICS is important, and also what's happening in the world is important, because now that you have this crisis in the West, African nations are also learning from the Russian situation, where sanctions were levied against Russia. They're saying, oh, if this can be done to Russia, then it can also be done to all these African states, where I know the price of oil was with the whole war, in the very beginning, the Durand talks about this, where European powers are saying, or the US is saying, Russia can't, like they're not allowed to sell oil above the price cap of $60. But then the way they enforced it was through insurance companies that covered the shipments of oil, but this isn't working. But at the same time, it's showing to all these African nations that, like these various institutions of commerce, of trade, are not sustainable for these countries. And so now they're like, we need to figure out a way so that we're not sanctioned, we can still trade. But one important thing is that in our group, we talked about how money and trade, the basis is also political, where Africa and Asia are now forming new political alliances, the way that in the US we're forming new political alliances. And I think, I don't know how dominant this is, but people have been critiquing BRICS too, saying it's just like, it's not had its act together yet, but it's something new emerging. And there's much to figure out, including this concept of the dollar that maybe Jeremiah will go into. But it's very exciting, and I think for us, in trying to understand what's going on, we're trying to go back to figures such as Du Bois and Nkrumah, who were able to explain how, like the genesis of what we see today, even the genesis, but also how it's changed, is also for us to be able to interpret for our times.
I want to, unless I'm stealing your thunder, I would like to think about the connection between the domestic crisis and the international crisis. From I guess the inception around this time, you described the imperialism, which is another way to say, or the long-standing effects of monopoly, where the United States wants to have a monopoly on raw materials. They want to have a monopoly on production. They're the only ones producing things, and they want to have a wide enough market for export. And this competition leads to war and has led to the world wars. And you had rebellion from the exploited peoples, darker peoples, that led to political independence. And then you had the American people that they were being exploited as well, and they didn't like the way they fit into the system. And so you had neocolonialism to have control over the darker peoples that are being exploited, even though they have political independence. When you control the economy and the money, you can control the country. And then the rebellion here, especially by the civil rights movement, expanding past. Once they built racial unity, they're able to expand to have broader reaching implications for the life of the people. And the kind of I feel like the solution that they came up with was and at that time the darker peoples of America view themselves as two sides of the same coin of the darker peoples of the rest of the world, and resisted exploitation on all fronts. You exploit the people in other countries, that gives you power to exploit us. You exploit us, that gives you power to exploit the other countries, and we don't want to be a part of it at all. One of the solutions was putting the factories in other poor countries like China. Given that they had economic means of control laid out in neocolonialism, technically that I don't want to go into that because it's a lot to describe, but they felt they could control these other countries even if they were producing goods. And that would weaken the American people, and they wouldn't have. We see the effects of deindustrialization, like in the city. You don't have a financial basis. You're too weak to stand up for yourself. You're worried about survival too much. And now it's falling in on them altogether, because the American people are immiserated. We don't have jobs, and the whole bulk of our country, a lot of it, too much of it, is geared towards war to continue this control in other countries where there is production, and they do have financial means of control that aren't holding anymore. And so the American people are like, well, you're destroying, you're keeping us oppressed, and you're using that to oppress other people, and that's not helping us at all. And now you have these oppressed people in other countries that are saying, we're not going to allow you to tell us what to do anymore. We have enough strength right now to stand up to you. And so it's caving in on both sides. And this opens up a world of possibility to consider what we talked about in Band Reading Group of a peace industrial economy, a way of operating so that you can have prosperity broadly. Our basis of well-being is in industry, producing goods, and we don't want to have this war of competition. We need you to be productive as well, so that your production can be exchanged for my production, and we can all have what we need. Deeper conversation needed, but I'm seeing the connections between the international and the domestic crisis then and now that I guess is sharpened by and led by BRICS internationally, who are seeking to attack the means of control through things like de-dollarization and trade amongst themselves, and then the control over the American people is being led by Donald Trump attacking what you would call, what he would dub the deep state, but it is the state itself which is controlling us, especially through financial means, and to engage in war and oppression of the American people. So dual strategies right now on both fronts. I feel myself so happy to be part of this moment and part of the world.
Okay, I have things to add to my colleagues here. Okay, I'm going to talk about basically the dollar and neocolonialism, but also deindustrialization and war. And I feel like this is basically, in some ways, like restating what other people have said, but also trying to draw the link between when Nkrumah was writing Neocolonialism in the present moment. And yeah, I hope this isn't, I'm going to try to make this exciting, but I know that it's like pretty late, and also we've all been talking for a while.
We're
so
excited.
Yeah. You got
it. But yeah, I just want to start by saying, like, this is a very basic thing, but what Lenin establishes, which maybe he got from someone else, but which Nkrumah also talks about, like on a very basic level, imperialism being the exporting of contradictions within capitalist society to a global scale. And what that means is also that the contradictions of capitalism, that they propel basically like a crisis within the capitalist society, and that it also like part of what a manifestation of that is that like a social movement, which then needs to basically be neutralized by the ruling class, and so the strategy for countering that is imperialism. And so as part of another way of saying that is that something that I've been thinking about a lot and trying to figure out is that imperialism and also I know that there's a lot of stuff in here, and I'm not an economist, and I also maybe probably get some things wrong, but that, like, to my understanding, what imperialism tries to do is to provide the appearance of benefit for the citizens and workers of the capitalist country. But then because it's not actually resolving the contradiction itself, the central contradiction itself, then the contradictions still develop, they atrophy, they intensify. This leads to further crisis in which the ruling class then has to do another kind of, to basically pivot its strategy. And so yeah, that's basically like a broader, I guess, framing of it. But something that's been very interesting in the Bandung discussions of neocolonialism, and Danny brought this up, is that basically something like money, like the US dollar, that it assumes a new social, ideological, political content through the movement of new stages of history, and that basically money can represent new types of social relations, and also for the purposes of this discussion, that the US dollar, as others have said, represents the link between the domestic and the international crisis. And so basically at the time of Nkrumah writing Neocolonialism, my understanding of the actual strategy of neocolonialism at that time, which was by basically the 1960s, mid-1960s, is that basically imperialism seeks to maintain the dependency and degradation of essentially the formerly colonized world, while also trying to enforce this division between the American worker and darker humanity. And through basically what Nkrumah says is that the capitalist class wants to offer some benefits, quote unquote benefits, to, like, let's say the American population through a welfare state. And as part of this, that means offering more stable employment, maintaining a certain high level of industrialization, and that all of this is sort of geared to enforce this division so that the American people don't identify with the colonial world. And meanwhile, basically people have said this, but that meanwhile after World War II, the US emerges as this inheritor of Western colonialism and also global capitalism more generally, and that with the establishment of the Bretton Woods system after the Second World War, the US dollar then becomes the predominant global reserve currency in the international economy, and that there's also linked with this promise that any dollar reserves that are held by other countries, that these can be exchanged for gold. And so the dollar with the Bretton Woods system post-World War II is pegged to essentially the value of gold. And that during this time also, because the US was able to emerge from World War II relatively unscathed and with a high level of basically manufacturing output and production, that the US was able to act as a net creditor nation, in which it was basically pouring lots of money into Europe through the Marshall Plan and stuff, and also other forms of loan and aid. And that also, basically post-World War II, America had a trade surplus. And so part of the Marshall Plan strategy was to pour American-made goods into the European market, basically to overpower the European market. And so in this context, the dollar in its new status as the global reserve currency is ultimately, at the bottom line, a political indicator of the global quote-unquote global trust in the U.S. government and the U.S. economy. Or another way of saying that is that it is an indicator of other countries becoming subservient to primarily the ideological dominance of U.S. hegemony. And so basically when Nkrumah is tracking these vast amounts of American dollars that are quote unquote invested in Africa, for instance, or given as foreign aid, that this is it's not really even about the money itself, but it's more about how do you understand the strategy of monopoly capital in this new stage of history in which investment, maybe counterintuitively, the investment in Africa, for instance, doesn't lead to the industrialization of Africa, but actually is something that enforces the underdevelopment of Africa. But then something, like Eddie said, something happens which is unpredicted by the ruling elite, which is that the achievement of a certain level of stability by the black proletariat in particular, post-World War II, provides an anchor for something like the Black Freedom Movement to emerge, in which despite the attempts of the ruling elite, black people, despite the strategy of neocolonialism, black people still, as Eddie said, choose to identify with the darker world, which also leads them to basically oppose the ruling elite general strategy in terms of war, like neocolonialism, all of this stuff, and that what the Black Freedom Movement was able to achieve in terms of countering the strategy of neocolonialism means that triggered then the ruling elite's impulse towards this new phenomenon, which Nkrumah didn't really see or didn't live through, but that was the new, the ruling elite's impulse towards the extreme deindustrialization of the US economy, in which, as Eddie said, at least higher end, the higher end of production was moved to other places like Japan or China, where it was assumed that the labor force was quote unquote more docile. And that also simultaneously with this happening, the other really big motivating phenomenon of this kind of evolution in neocolonialism is the war in Vietnam, which essentially incurs these untold levels of spending by the federal government, and it gets to a point where Charles de Gaulle, then the president of France, threatens to cash in France's dollar reserves for gold. And that this is what basically sparks Nixon in 1971 to take the dollar off the gold standard. So this is something that is not sort of included in the narrative of neocolonialism because it was published before then. Basically, with taking the dollar off the gold standard, you make the dollar more of a fiat currency whose main connection, if it's connected to anything, is basically the connection to oil. So you have the petrodollar and also the US's agreement with all these OPEC nations like Saudi Arabia, all that stuff. And over the next decade, as a
Can I just
result,
say something, if you don't mind me? This concept, I think the petrodollar and fiat currency are not identical.
Right.
And maybe you can explain petrodollar. But a fiat currency is a currency that is only backed up by the good faith and whatever they say of its government.
Yes.
And that's why it's a political choice to go off the gold standard, but a political choice between the United States and Saudi Arabia that oil would only be sold in dollars.
Right. So it's not like the value of the dollar is linked to the value of oil, but it's that because oil is so central to the global economy, then if basically all these like the Middle Eastern countries, the OPEC countries, like we will only trade our oil in dollars, and so that basically leads to, it further enforces then like that you have to have dollars, you have to trade in dollars, and but then that ultimately it's still like a fiat system in which the value of the dollar is not necessarily pegged to like the value of oil per se, but that there's still a connection. I don't know. It's also something I'm trying to wrap my brain around.
If I might just say, I feel that, first of all, the theory of money is one of the most complicated and contested theories in all of economics. I don't care whether you're liberal or conservative or radical, Marxist, whatever. Theory of money. But I think the dollar, which is a specific instance of money, I don't think throughout modern history there's been what we would call a fiat currency. No country's government would trust any other country's government with their money, except if you need the dollar to buy oil, which means you therefore have to keep it in your banks, but also it means that your government has to buy dollars on, in money markets. International has to buy dollars, which is a way of keeping the price of the dollar elevated. Which means, if you don't mind me saying, de-dollarization potentially so changes the architecture of currencies that it could undermine not only the dollar, but the whole system that rises on the basis of the permanence of the dollar, which is, like somebody said, the 75-year cycle, the Kondratian wave. I just give me
I think that's I'm basically what I'm trying to like also understand, but like something that is very interesting to me in this period in which the dollar goes off the gold standard post 1971 is that basically over the next 10 years the US transitions from what you would say like a net creditor nation to a net debtor nation. And as part of this, America starts to weaponize its own debt and the dollar in a new way that I don't think had ever been seen before. And so, this is like very complicated stuff. But basically, my understanding is that usually, if a country is in debt, that's a sign of its dependence on like another nation, for instance. And that this is still true for most of the countries that are still subjugated under neocolonialism, in which Nkrumah describes debt as a function which basically makes all of these African countries subservient to like the IMF, like that whole thing. But uniquely for the United States, debt in which it is quote unquote borrowing dollars from other countries is one, first of all, you have to understand this in the context of the US as a global reserve currency, but that what this debt mechanism for the US, what it's able to do is that it allows the federal government, and also remembering that this is in the context of the war in Vietnam, all of that stuff, but debt allows the federal government to essentially fund a continual war agenda, and that the debt that the US incurs is essentially, almost all of it is directed towards military expenditure, keeping up this like 800 military bases around the world. And so even while like, let's say American politicians and the media will make a lot of noise around the national debt and being like, oh my God, we can't pay this debt. The point is really there's no one assumes or believes, no one is saying, oh, the US needs to pay off its debt. That's not the point. It's like no one is going, like no country is going to be like, the US needs to pay off its debt. The US is not in danger of defaulting on its debt. Like that's not the point. But the real point is that, like, through this whole debt mechanism, it's not that, let's say because China is still the greatest holder of American debt still, even though it's trying to kind of shovel off its dollars. But America is not, quote unquote, subservient to China, which I think is what a lot of people get wrong, but that because of this strange debt phenomenon with the US as a global reserve currency, what that means is that instead of US being subservient to China through debt, actually the US uses this debt in order to essentially fund its own war machine and war agenda. And so you get to the situation where China, in basically purchasing US dollars, all that stuff, is actually in a counter to the almost funding the America's war agenda against itself, which is I think what the Chinese are realizing. And that's why they're trying to shovel off the dollar. And also simultaneously with this is like the connection that I feel like is really important, is that the dollar as a global reserve currency in this particular stage incentivized the deindustrialization of America, because the demand for dollars abroad means that the US needs to export these dollars while also importing foreign goods, right? Because basically that's like the trade deficit thing, the balance of current, like the balance of payments. And so the supposed benefit of this for Americans is that it means cheaper consumer goods for the American consumer. So far. And this was kind of the trade-off, the kind of bargain that was made ideologically by the ruling class with this. But meanwhile, as a consequence of this, obviously you get deindustrialization, in which the American industrial and manufacturing output plummets. All of these jobs are shipped overseas, and the US is no longer the manufacturing, like the factory of the world. And then finally, okay, sorry, I'm really reaching the end, but the dollar as a global reserve currency, and this is what other people brought up, that this allows the kind of most clearly ideological and political form of the dollar is that it allows the US to sanction countries like Russia, North Korea, Iran, etc. And so with BRICS, this is like that sort of weaponization of the dollar through sanctions is basically one of the main factors that's motivating the move towards de-dollarization globally in order to create these new kind of currency exchange systems to conduct trade amongst these countries, because none of them, whether they have friendly relations right now with the US or not, no country wants to have this looming threat of US sanction hanging over their heads like, like a sword basically. And so just to agree with everyone here, that de-dollarization as a global phenomenon is clearly connected to the domestic crisis of legitimacy, because the question that is posed by the dollar in this current stage is like, what does it mean when the dollar, which should ultimately reflect the relationship between the US citizenry and the US state, what does it mean when something like the dollar exists so far beyond the control of the American population themselves? In the same way that the question of war poses the question of, like, what does it mean when all of these wars are waged on our behalf as Americans, but we have no democratic say in the matter? And then on the other side of this, what does it mean for the dollar and its current status as a symbol of, quote, global trust in the US government, when the US citizenry themselves clearly no longer trust their own government? This is why Richard Haas is saying the most dangerous aspect, the most dangerous side of the global crisis is the collapse of the legitimacy of the ruling class, and something which is also central to like the dollar itself. And so I just want to end by saying that I think something like de-dollarization as a general phenomenon will have very significant ramifications for the US population. And I do think that it's not an easy question. And I think that navigating it will be very difficult. But it should also, because basically someone like, for instance, Tucker Carlson, or even like RFK Jr. will be like, de-dollarization is a sign of the failure, the policy failure of the US elites, but they're still kind of linked, they still are invested in having the dollar as a global reserve currency. But that for us, and I feel like for the American people, it should be seen as an opportunity for something new, because it's an opportunity for like basically a new era of industrialization of the American economy on new terms that are set by the American people, and also for the end of the use of the dollar as like an instrument of war, but also generally speaking, for a new kind of like relationship between the American people and the state, or the establishment of a new state. So yeah, that's basically what I was trying to connect.
Because I think, well, I think the deindustrialization stage is really interesting and important because going back to this thread of imperialism trying to maintain the illusion of benefit or like little crumbs of benefit, I feel like what you said, which is that the trade-off with deindustrialization was that supposedly still consumer goods were relatively cheap. That was like the benefit, which is what you're supposed to focus on. But I feel like the other aspect of deindustrialization was the move into a financial economy, where what is prioritized, like clearly what is prioritized is no longer domestic industry or production, but rather going all in on the dollar as like the symbol and actually like the weapon, which is like the only power that the American economy or like political structure actually has at this point. And that's why like now it's basically sanctions and like all of this stuff. But I think the relationship between, I guess, finance capital and industrial capital is also very interesting to me in the question of the people, the state, and democracy. Because part of it is like we want for, because I think basically the monster is like finance capital, but in the hands of the elite and the way that it is weaponized by like the state and how undemocratic that is. But I think I think it's sort of like the two prongs of struggle, which is like both the American people rejecting the dollar and the finance like rule of the state, along with like the world system, which is that I feel like de-dollarization in some ways like is a painful and challenging question, but the only real way to make sense of it is also to ask like, what is the state? Or like what, because I think basically with the peace industrial economy, I think something that's really interesting about it is then what is the role of finance? Because there is still a role of finance in the world clearly, and that's also what BRICS is trying to address, which is that finance is like an element or an aspect of the world economy that has to be dealt with, but it basically cannot proceed on the terms of purely just the American dollar as the reserve currency. And that's, I think, what BRICS is moving towards. And so I think because it's kind of like, it's not as though it should just be an American industrial economy where America doesn't trade with any other nations anymore, but it's more of like, like what actually is the role of finance. And I think part of what we had been talking about in the reading group too is that if finance is at this point inextricably bound up with the state, I think the question of it is not to say we want to get rid of finance entirely, like we don't want to deal with like capital or large amounts of money, but rather what should it be used for? Is the point of capital to like in finance to fund war, or is it to like actually plan like a state or to plan an economy?
I'm sure I will need to listen to this a number of times to really grasp the nuances, but one of the questions that came to my mind is, if we do go along this path of de-dollarization, would the US be forced to re-industrialize? And where does that put us on the question of war and peace?
In other words, what would be the response to that?
I'm sorry?
What would be the response to what you said, the de-dollarization? You're saying?
No, he's just saying. He's just rephrasing it.
And that's a good question.
Wait, can you repeat your question?
So I wanted to, one of the questions that came to my mind was, if we do go along this path of de-dollarization, would the US be forced to re-industrialize, to bring back actual working industries inside the country? And where does that lead? Where does that put us on the question of war and peace? How would the US react to this de-dollarization?
I want to say something. I'm not sure of my answer at all, but I think you see this kind of compulsion and a change in thinking in Bidenomics, for instance, and the fact that Biden is, now his thing is, I'm pro-union, I'm going to reindustrialize this country, but never ever connects the question of the crisis of the industrial organization in America to the question of war and peace. So I feel like, again, this is not an answer, but this compulsion that has been set forth by something like BRICS, something like these new alliances forming, and also the possibility of de-dollarization has alerted, arms of the state that there has to be a change in economic policy in this country. And that has to come through production first, a reindustrialization kind of strategy. But I think they're still in this phase where they're trying to pull a fast one and make it compatible with the military industrial.
Well, because I think the thing is that a lot of this reindustrialization, I feel like, is almost like trying to gear up to be like, oh no, if we do have to go to war with China, we actually definitely need an economy.
We don't have to go because we
if we do go to war with China, we're fucked in this current position. We have to actually have industry. So because I think even with the war in Ukraine, it's we ran out of weapons to give stuff like basic stuff. But I think I think basically the relationship between industry, war, and peace is. Wait, Dwight, what was your question again? I feel like it's related to how you framed it.
I was just commenting on what he said. How would the United States react to what you were saying?
Yeah.
And they would react.
Yeah, they would. But I think then the question is also how would the current state react? What would their preferred outcome be? And then what is actually in the interest of the people and how they see it? And then what is actually the huge discrepancy between those two? Because I think the thing is that, basically right now it's the state that wields the dollar and uses it. I feel like Americans, by and large, are kind of don't really think the dollar is doing that well. And so I think that's also why the domestic struggle is linked to the international struggle, and it's also so important because that's basically the question of what is going to happen to this country? What side are we going to take with the direction that the world has definitely decided that it wants to go in? Because I think then the United States...
Yeah, no, I was thinking, you guys were talking about dialectics and all that. Well, there's a response, but what you're saying is the world asking for some sort of fairness. That's what you're saying. Some sort of fairness in the world economy, and the United States reaction with people like yourself and other people thinking that they need to change the way they look at the dollar, and they need to change how the world economy, how money, food, and all those things are distributed throughout the world. So it would be good. Even in terms of the dialectics, you talk about response pieces, and it would be good, and that is happening with these countries that, what you just said, Brexit. So all that can be a sign of progress. Now, if the United States reacts in a very nationalistic way, then it won't be good. I think they react. But if they react, but if it raises the kind of saying, look, we need to change the way we treat the world, then it's a movement towards progress.
Yeah, I think that's also the citizen thing, which is what citizen, what country or what place are you a citizen of? Are you a citizen of basically this war state? Or are you a citizen of the new American people, which is a citizen of the world?
Well, you're talking about the notion of cosmopolitan, right? That whole idea. No? Oh, no? Okay, I heard a big no. Well, that's what Khan, a couple of people did. But that's all right. That's all right.
No, I was gonna.
Go.
No, I was just gonna add, which is that I think the U.S. has been so used to a way of conducting politics internationally, where even at this point, for example, Xi Jinping is I'm not going to talk to Biden because the U.S. just sets up contracts that it never obeys, and so it will be painful, I think, definitely for the ruling elite in this country, where it will have to conduct affairs in a fair way. But that feels like a loss because it's not been conducting diplomacy in a fair way. So you're coming from a place where you're cheating people to a level where you're not, and that feels like a loss already. And then the other piece is I think it is a tough question for the US, but so is it for the rest of the world. Because as we were talking about neocolonialism, like Africa's situation is tough, where it's been completely, like it hasn't had a chance to industrialize except for maybe South Africa, and it's single crop, like per nation. And there are many questions of like, yeah, how do you industrialize Africa in a way so that it's able to use its resources to feed, clothe, whatever for its people. And that, I guess I say all that to say like America will have to be kind of in the sense of, yes, like listen to the concerns of its people, but also recognize that for once, America doesn't have all the answers. It will have to work with Africa and Asia. One is like a big if of we're able to pull out from this military apparatus of like having military bases throughout the world. And because that's, I feel like what we're talking about at World House, where we're working with other countries to figure out like, what are the needs of the people.
There was a book maybe about 10 years ago, I forget the author's name all the time, called Exorbitant Privilege. And it was an examination of the privileges that accrue to the United States ruling elite because of this unique position of the dollar in the world economy. And it is nothing like this, I agree with you, Jerry, has ever existed, where one currency has such power and can be weaponized against so many countries. But one of the things Lenin said in his Imperialism, that going from industrial to finance capital as the dominant form is creating a ruling class that is parasitic. And well, that's what we exist under, a ruling elite that serves finance capital in its many forms, not just banks, not just hedge funds, but what finance capital can do in the society, because it can determine the cost of borrowing. So if the cost of borrowing is 2% for prime borrowing banks, well, you can finance a lot of things, like gentrification. The reason Chicago looks so much better than Philadelphia is because Chicago, first being in the Midwest, there are no other major cities that can compete to it, but it is a center of finance capital. And this goes back to the industrial age, the building up of Chicago banks as alternative to the New York banks. The same thing with San Francisco. It becomes this beautiful city because the finance capitalists wanted a beautiful city that they could live in. But this control over money, and again I say, it does not make you smart or not smart not to understand money. Even the people who study money professionally don't understand money. It's a conundrum, it's a mystery. We can talk about how it functions, but bank capital or finance capital is the dominant form of capital in the United States, which means that those who are in a position to make strategic decisions are fewer and fewer people connected to wealth the likes of which no one could have imagined, even 20 years ago. A trillionaire corporation, a rapper becoming a billionaire, and I think so much that we in the free school object to in culture is a direct result of the total control over so much in society by a small group of people who are parasitic and are only interested in making money. They're not interested in culture. If they were interested in culture, you'd never get rap culture. And I'll say that to, to the most fervent hip hop heads. You don't exist. You have nothing to talk about if finance capitalists didn't invest in some bullshit. And finance capital has almost consigned those of us interested, like Kathy, this I'm thinking about our conversation, interested in serious people's culture, you've consigned that to the margins. And you've made parasitic culture. Think about the values of hip hop. Don't tell me about what it originally was. Think about what it morphed into in its most generalized popular sense. It celebrates parasitism, even lumpen proletarianism. The lumpen déclassé. But it is an, quote, art form that the financial oligarchy is comfortable with. John Coltrane, a love supreme, oh, we don't need that. Love, and a love supreme, God, we don't need that. Boundaries, oh no. All of these mini movements that make no sense from the standpoint of the masses of people make all the sense from the standpoint of finance capital. Think about it. Even going so far as string theory, heavily invested in, invested in, who has the money to invest? Once you hear the word invested in, your antenna should go up. Invested, oh, you're talking about finance capital now. So since you brought up finance capital, let's not just talk about string theory, let's talk about finance capital, if you dig where I'm coming from. And maybe, I say this, maybe the theory of money has been made more simplified because of this oligarchy that controls all of the money, and at least the flow of money, the availability of money, and then to even come up with a theory of money that says that money doesn't have to be based on anything other than money, or what I say it is. It is complicated in one sense, but then in another sense, it's very clear, especially, I agree with both of y'all on this, it's politics. And I agree with the state. Money functions to, one, of course, to secure the economic system, the trading system, but to secure the dominant hyper state. It's fucking chilling. And you can almost, and this is the, can almost see its tentacles in the life world of young people. There's nothing to live for. Everything is going to die, everything is throwaway anyway. Your life don't mean shit. That's what they're saying, but where's it coming from? The trillionaire class, the money changers, the money controllers, the life of black people. Every politician is bought and paid for. We have no politicians that are anchored in a movement of black people. It's not there. They're not there, I can tell you. But they're very aware of their connections to finance capital. So they take on the parasitic values of the parasitic class. And I guess I know this whole question of how we pull the youth back from the precipice. How do we pull them back? I think in part a discussion of money and what you think is real, what you believe has been produced and made available to the people and to the youth by people who control money and will say what you can see, what you can hear, what you can learn, how you can exist. But it's a parasitic class who, because they control money, can control so much else about society. Why don't we hear Archie Shepp? He's relevant today. Still great music. Great, great, great music. Music of the, why don't you hear him? Why is that name not known? But Lil Jeezy is. or Jay-Z.
No, the baby.
I got the baby out there now? I didn't know about the baby. Okay. I mean, which have turned black culture and black people into minstrelsies and stereotypes. Oh, they're not serious. All we want to do is have fun. Why are you restricting our right to party? You know, like, I mean, you are restricting the greatest freedom of all. The freedom to party and get drunk, you know? And you must be a communist since you're not upholding my right to party. But the values of a parasitic elite, I don't know how, and I guess we're not saying that enough. Maybe we need to, we'll find ways to.
Right.
And of course, I would just say, I think that you got a 300%.
Yeah.
The crisis of the neo-colonial system is why the Bretton Woods system was set up in the first place. To control the vast colonial territories of the European colonial powers, which had collapsed. You know, and that's what Du Bois in chapter 1 of World Now, the collapse of Europe. And then what comes next, and what came next is what Nkrumah talks about, neocolonialism, a more insidious form of colonialism. Because now, Africa, to fight neocolonialism, has to overcome deep political divisions that go back to the Berlin Conference of 1884, the partitioning of Africa. And as long as people in Burkina Faso see themselves, oh, we're Burkina Fascians, or the people of Niger, we're Nigerians, or the people of Mali, we're Malian. Well, put all them countries together, you know, you got now about 5 million people with a lot of resources. But you can't do anything. Even if you have a coup and say we don't want it this way, we want to hook up with Russia, you still can. You have to find a way to unity. By the way, a political realignment on the African continent. A lot of people don't like to talk about the contradictions and self-sabotaging of Africa by Africans. And the establishment of corrupt regimes under the protection of Western finance capital. You know what I'm saying? They seldom talk about how corrupt Nigeria is. I got friends who spent time in Nigeria. Oh, we can't talk about that. Why can't you? Because if you're going to talk about, you have to talk about the largest population in Africa being one of the most corrupt countries in the world, whose currency is based upon the US dollar, and whose ruling class, all of their children are educated at Harvard and the Ivy League and don't know shit. Corruption. But without a political realignment on the African continent, they cannot fight neocolonialism. And just one last thing. India is still, in many ways, in the throes of neocolonialism. A little more sophisticated. You know, India is a lot more wealthy than Nigeria or South Africa. However, and this is the question for Modi, and I give Modi and them a better shot than I would give the Congress Party. The Congress Party of India is the Democratic Party with a different name, a different country. But you have to have a movement, and it would be a nationalist movement, a national liberation movement in India, which says that we are not going to link ourselves to the dollar. And they're basically saying it in India. And this is the key. And Modi has said it, Xi Jinping has said, rapprochement between China and India. The largest economy in the world being China, let's get that real. The fifth largest economy in the world being India, right? Okay, Japan is an outlier, don't nobody trust the Japanese, don't fuck with them. For obvious reasons, you're talking about backstabbing. They don't even get behind your back, they go right in front. I mean, what they have done, I mean, the Asian, and then you're talking about white supremacy in a yellow face. That's what the Japanese did. All the rest of y'all are inferior people. We're gonna commit genocide on you because you don't count unless you come under us. But forgive me for
It's the inner Chinese talking.
Or is it the inner Korean?
Yeah, or is it the inner
Korean? That's why, oh, by the way, Shoigu, the defense minister of China, he was in North Korea, and he said the most powerful army in the world is the North Korean army. I'm not surprised. I am not surprised. The North Korean society has achieved every goal that it sets for itself. 25 million people, half the size of the population of South Korea, no imperialist backers, sanctions on it all around it. How did it do this? And that's a question we've not yet answered. I think it's probably maybe the most developed society in the world. Weak economic relations, but human capital. Unbelievable. But I say all of that to make this point. The BRICS currency. BRICS is saying we'll have a basket of currencies, but they'll all be based upon gold. Russia, China, buying up all the gold they can get their hands on while they get rid of dollars. The big one, and this is my last one. When Saudi Arabia, I remember I came to Cornell and I talked about the petro-yuan. They thought I was on the pipe. You know? I said, what is that guy talking about? Well, now we see it. Where China, the largest buyer of Gulf state, including Saudi Arabian oil, trades in oil in renminbi. Well, I thought that the agreement made in the 1950s is that Saudi Arabia would only sell oil in dollars. That is shattered. Then, two of the major OPEC countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, reached a rapprochement over the objections of American finance capital. So not only did we do it, we did it and told y'all to kiss our behinds. Both cheeks, as they say. I'm talking street talk, forgive me. What they say, kiss where your eyes don't go. Something like that, you know, all kind of bullshit. But kiss something that you don't normally kiss. This is huge. And I agree. When you look at that and the domestic realignment and political crisis, global political crisis based upon the crisis of neocolonialism, none of us could have seen it. Nkrumah could not have seen it. He was diagnosing it. Certainly Lenin's general theory didn't see it. And the empirically specific one, Nkrumah, could not have seen it. But here it is. But it took certain other events to have happened. Overreach by the United States militarily, the wars in the Middle East, $7 trillion, and the US can default. It can default because already the debt is over 1.5 times the GDP. Most of the debt owed to other countries. Suppose those countries said, I don't know what the agreements were. Suppose those countries said, well, don't pay us back in dollars, we pay us back in gold. We want something that counts. Because the way you know is manipulating the dollar, inflation is out, and oh, by the way, inflation is a malady of a system that's out of order. Okay. You know, Martin Wolf, 2 things he brings up in his articles. Social economic inequality and deindustrialization. Remember the 4th? I forget the other 2. But those 2 are the direct result of finance capital and their control of the state, which brings us back to the state. It is state policy. This monetary arrangement supports the US imperial state. That's when they say Pax Americana, Pax Romana, Pax Britannica. Pax don't mean peace. It means under the rule of a super state. 800 military bases. Why do you need that many? Some people say it's up to 1,000. Why? We are the policemen of the whole world. What are you policing? Well, the people, but more than that, the dollar. Not Apple factories in China or GM factories in Vietnam or China. That ain't the real deal. Protecting the dollar hegemony, because that makes it all possible. But in the meantime, as Baldwin said, for long meantime, the Kondratyov wave, in the long meantime, they have sacrificed the American people to the hegemony of the dollar. This is a brutal, ugly, vicious process by a parasitic group that couldn't give a fuck about whether your children were shot on the street or whether there's a Kensington. That's collateral damage to them. 1,600,000 Iraqi children dying because they can't get medicine. That's the cost we have to pay to be the boss. Kill Gaddafi, sovereign leader. Oh, that's the cost of doing business in the world. You see what I'm saying? Their framework of making decisions, the way they talk about the world, is so out of order from what human beings think. The way we think, the way we live, what we aspire to. And that's what we have to say to the young generation. We are under a regime that has utter contempt for you and for those that you don't think you're the same as, like those poor black working people that work every day here. You might have more in common with them than you know, and certainly more in common with them than you do with the professors at Wharton School of Business. Because we take care of business. we doing business up in here. But then you ain't doing business because all the business is at the level of the state. I swear if I talked.
Maybe we can do comments.
Oh yeah, we should.
And then
I'm
wrap up.
sorry,
No, you're
Emily. I saw you looking at me. Gosh.
Well, do it.
I'm only.
I want to read something to you, because you were talking about Nkrumah.
Yeah.
And Dr. Walkman, he had this.
Oh yeah, Dr. Walkman.
This is first-hand information about Nkrumah, which I thought you guys.
He was the president of
He was the
Lincoln.
president of Lincoln when we were there, and he actually visited Nkrumah. And here he talks about, well, the overthrow, when you're talking about neocolonialism, this part. Very short, but I thought, you guys would be interested. Within a year of that visit, in February 1966, Nkrumah was on his way to Hanoi to visit North Vietnam President Ho Chi Minh. Quote, with proposals for ending the war in Vietnam. When he stopped in Peking en route to Hanoi, he was greeted with the news that the regime had been overthrown. In Dog Days in Ghana, that's a book he wrote in 1967, while in exile in Guinea. Nkrumah strongly implies that American CIA masterminded the coup. He was particularly bitter about the alleged role of Ambassador Franklin Williams, who was a Lincoln graduate, in bribing Nkrumah's enemy to carry out his overthrow. Quote, it is particularly disgraceful that it should have been an Afro-American ambassador who sold himself out to the imperialists and allowed himself to be used in this way, Nkrumah wrote. However, his treachery provides sharp reminders of the insidious ways in which the enemies of Africa can operate. In the USA, the quote, Uncle Tom figure is well known. We have mercifully seen less of him in Africa. The activities of the CIA no longer surprise us. And this Franklin Williams, a 1941 Lincoln University graduate, was so upset by this charge that he asked me, we're talking about Walkman, to intercede for him with Nkrumah and explain that he had nothing at all to do with the coup. I did write Nkrumah, but did not hear from him. He died in 1968.
No, he died.
He said 1968, age 58. This is what Walkman said.
He died in 1971. That's right.
And this would be interesting, talking about this academic last part I want to share with you. This is when he was in Lincoln. He said, in a conversation with, Walkman says, in a conversation, our conversation was lively, somebody Nkrumah. Nkrumah had an alert mind and many memories of Lincoln University, and many ideas about governing his country, democracy, capitalism, and what he called conscientism, the title of one of his books. In our conversation, he particularly emphasized the shortcomings of capitalism, the importance of the independence of African nations, and their not being beholden to the West. Having read already widely in philosophy, theology, and economics, he was a very articulate critic of free market capitalism. He inscribed a number of his books for us and presented them with his best wishes so that we could better learn his philosophy. As our first interview concluded, and his photographer appeared, and the next day we found our pictures in the Accra newspaper, Nkrumah standing with us and smiling broadly. This is the last paragraph, which I think is interesting. Nkrumah gave us permission to visit the closed National Archives. I could see no good reason why the archives were closed other than the Nkrumah camp's paranoia about supposed assassination attempts. Here we found manuscript copies of his writings while a student at Lincoln and Penn, including his incomplete PhD dissertation, and Walkman says, which struck me more like an incomplete master's thesis, but he says his former classmates at Lincoln had told us that Nkrumah had written a doctoral dissertation, but that no one on the Penn faculty had felt qualified to judge it. Such was the shortage of African expertise on Penn faculty at the time. In his autobiography, one of the books Nkrumah gave us he recounts that he had completed all the coursework for the PhD, but did not finish his dissertation because his teaching responsibilities and his job at the Sun shipyards in Wilmington, Delaware, which he took in order to pay his bills. With his heavy schedule, he became ill, decided to return home to Ghana after studying and working in the United States for 10 years. His books written after his return indicated that he certainly could have completed an acceptable dissertation if he had had the time and made the effort to complete it. But I just wanted to say that this was someone who had insights into talking about it. And I thought, you might want to. And there's more, and of course in this book they mentioned Tony.
Really?
We'll talk. I'll say that for next time. Yeah, about him. Well, stop. I'll stop. But I just wanted to share. I thought you guys.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just try to there are a lot of comments actually, but maybe I'll do Facebook first and summarize. So Brother Jerome is linking to a piece he wrote on the weaponization of debt and America as like the principal culprit of that weaponization. And he links like an excerpt to it, which I don't think I'll read, but the headline is Africa is trapped in unpayable debt by the IMF and the World Bank. And yeah, he like describes how debt as a form of imperialism went global and the IMF's role in all of that too.
There's Minister Farrakhan saying that, right?
No, not all of it.
Some of it, okay.
Yeah, not that part. And then Jasper Thomas asked, this may have been discussed, and I apologize if that's the case, but what is the relationship between imperialism and neocolonialism? And he asked that because how do you avoid reinforcing the narrative today that reduces everything to settler colonialism, which Doc has criticized in the past? I feel like, yeah, talk about it another time.
I think, Jasper, that's so implicit in the conversation that, see, and that's, if I might just say something, this book is entitled Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. Lenin's groundbreaking work is called Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. So if we're talking about colonialism and neocolonialism, we're talking really about, well, not just modern day, but contemporary imperialism. And if we talk about the crisis of neocolonialism, we're also talking about a crisis of imperialism.
Yeah, and then Brother Jerome also, in the article, I think he describes the meaning of the petrodollar and the history of it, and basically I think the relationship between, like financial institutions like Citibank, Chase Manhattan, and then all of this stuff in relation to Africa. And then Jasper adds, Kant said in his essay on peace that no national debt should be contracted in connection with the external affairs of the state. And so if, summarize, sorry, it's a really long comment. Let's see. Like basically, a credit system, if a power uses it as an instrument of aggression, as it is used by the United States, that is the power of money in its most dangerous form. And that this system can be used as a military fund, which exceeds the resources of all other states put together, which I think is what we were describing. And that basically, it can be used as a tool to make war, and according to Kant, that is an obstacle to perpetual peace. And that other states are justified in allying themselves against a state that abuses that financial power and its pretensions. So I think he's just connecting it to Kant, and I guess these ideas about money and the state have actually been discussed a lot. But then YouTube, Theo Henrik from the Philippines says, "From the ashes of the old, a new world is to be born. This is the historic role of the oppressed peoples of the world, to take back control of their destiny through class struggle." The concept of labor aristocracy is meant to ensure that the American people keep maintaining the empire of capital that is the US. But it's true that to achieve a higher state of class consciousness in America, it has to include the most oppressed in America. And I think he's talking about, the poor and the black proletariat. And then BK just suggests that the mass entrance of migrants into the US could potentially create a new cheap labor force within the country. And throughout history, we see that all fiat currencies based on faith eventually lose value. And then he's just sort of agreeing that if there's the words invested in, then you already know it's the beginning of the end. And then Christopher Romero just said, "Well said, Doc," I think in regards to what you had just said. Yeah, those are all the comments I see.
Conversation could keep going, but lunch.
It's lunchtime. It's lunchtime.
I think Sophia's work. Okay, well, I think it's lunchtime, so I think we'll stop there. But thanks for everyone who joined online, and it's really good to be back together. So we're looking forward for everyone to view us from the owl once again next week. Okay, bye.
Bye.